Your card's been declined." The manager's voice cut through the empty diner like a slap, and he flicked the black credit card across the table so it landed in the lap of the man in the wheelchair. "So either you pay right now, or I'm calling the cops. I know how it works with people like you. People like you." His eyes weren't on the man's face when he said it, they were on the wheels. It was 10 minutes to 1 on a freezing Tuesday night in Chicago, and the man in the chair didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything at all except go very, very still. The kind of still that should have told Gary Hutchins he was making the biggest mistake of his life. 3 booths away, a young woman in a worn-out courier jacket looked up from her coffee. Sadie Brennan was 27 years old and felt 50. Her shoes held together with glue and stubbornness, her pockets holding exactly $34 that had to last until Friday, and a debt notebook she couldn't bear to open anymore. She'd been invisible her whole life, the delivery girl nobody thanks, the woman doors get closed on, the name nobody remembers. Maybe that's why she recognized what was happening in that corner booth, because she knew exactly what it felt like to be looked at like you were less than a person. She stood up, walked to the register, and laid down 23 crumpled dollars of tip money, nearly everything she had. "I've got his bill," she said quietly, "and you owe this man an apology. Nobody in that diner, not the manager, not the tired waitress behind the counter, not even Sadie herself had the faintest idea that those $23 were about to summon 42 black SUVs to a rundown delivery depot before 8 o'clock the next morning. Because the man in the wheelchair, the one with the tailored suit and the quiet eyes that never stopped watching the door, wasn't some down on his luck stranger. His name was Cesare Falcone, and he happened to be the most powerful and most feared mafia boss in the city of Chicago, a man who hadn't let another human being pay for anything of his in 20 years, a man half the city whispered about, and the other half prayed they'd never meet. 2 years ago, an ambush took his younger brother's life and put a bullet in his spine, and ever since, the whole underworld had been whispering that the Falcon's wings were broken. They were wrong, and the exhausted delivery woman, who'd just emptied her pockets for him without asking his name, without wanting a single thing back, had no way of knowing that in his world, a debt isn't money, it's blood, it's honor, it's sacred. She didn't know that by sunrise, her name would be written at the top of a blank page in a penthouse overlooking the entire city. She didn't know that her one small act of decency was about to drag a vicious loan-sharking empire into the light, expose a traitor hiding in the last place anyone would look, and unravel a betrayal 2 years in the making that even Cesare Falcone himself didn't see coming. And she certainly didn't know that the most dangerous man in Chicago was about to discover the one thing his money, his power, and his army could never buy him. Because what happens when a woman with nothing left shows kindness to a man the whole world is afraid of? What happens when a broken king decides to repay a debt that can't be measured in dollars? Stay with this story, because the answer will stay with you for a long, long time. Before we dive in, if stories about kindness, karma, and justice hit home for you, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Share this video with somebody who still believes one good deed can change everything. And subscribe to the channel, because you won't want to miss what we're bringing you next. Now, let's get back to that freezing Tuesday night in Chicago, where it all began. The money hadn't even had time to settle on the counter before the whole diner seemed to change its very air. Gary Hutchins stood there for one more second, his mouth opening and closing, his fingers tapping against the edge of the cash register, as though he were searching for some sentence that might save what was left of his pride. But there wasn't one. He gathered the crumpled bills with the clumsy movements of a man who had just been stripped of his only weapon, muttered something that sounded more like a cough than words, then retreated toward the kitchen door, his shoulders folding inward beneath the neon light buzzing overhead. Sadie didn't watch him go. She returned to her booth, pulling out her debt notebook. With only $11 left for the next 4 days, the math never gave a pretty answer. As she sat staring at the numbers, the man in the wheelchair watched her from the corner booth. He noticed her worn-out sneakers and the heavy burden she carried, recognizing a rare, selfless kindness in her. When Lorna brought the coffee pot over and refilled Sadie's cup without asking, the man gave his wheels a gentle push, rolled slowly out of the booth, and stopped at a distance from her table that was still polite. Sadie looked up. From this close, He didn't look like anything she had imagined when she had glanced at him from across the room. His face had features as hard as carved stone, a faint scar running down his left temple, but his eyes were still, carrying the kind of weary silence she recognized at once, because she saw it every morning in her own bathroom mirror. He asked her name, his voice low and slow, the voice of a man who never needed to speak loudly. For one moment, the old instinct inside Sadie hesitated, the instinct of a woman living alone in a big city. But then she thought, it was 1 a.m, she had $11 left, she had just done the right thing, and there was nothing left in this world for someone like her to lose. She told him her name, Sadie Brennan, and he nodded slowly, as though he were placing that name somewhere very deep and very carefully, in a place where things once stored would never fall out. Cesare, he said. Only that, no last name, no title, nothing more. Then he said thank you. 2 words, without ornament, without promises, without asking for her phone number, or offering anything that life had taught her to be wary of. 2 words spoken with a weight Sadie had never heard anyone place upon those words before. She almost smiled and told him it was nothing, and to get home safely. He looked at her for 1 more second, nodded again, then rolled his chair toward the door, where the Chicago night swallowed his silhouette along with the sound of the engine of some large vehicle parked out of sight around the corner. Sadie stayed there another 20 minutes, finishing the free cup of coffee Lorna had given her because wasting it would have felt like a sin, then gathered her notebook and stepped out into the empty parking lot, where the cold wind slapped her face like a reminder that this year's winter would be long. The 11-year-old Ford Escape greeted her with the familiar rough cough of its ignition, once, twice, and not until the 4th try did the engine agree to wake, trembling like an old animal. She sat there waiting for it to warm up, both hands pressed toward the heater vents, and thought about the man named Cesare with the eyes of someone always guarding a door, thinking that maybe she would never see him again, that it had only been a small moment of kindness between 2 strangers in a long night, the kind of thing that would vanish before sunrise, like every other gentle thing in her life. She was wrong, because as her Escape rattled out of the parking lot, somewhere in the darkness ahead, her name was being repeated for the first time over a phone call, and Sadie Brennan had no idea that tonight she hadn't simply paid a bill. She had carved her name into a debt measured in flesh and blood and honor, the kind of debt that man had never once in his life forgotten to repay. The alarm rang at 5:30, and Sadie shut it off within 3 seconds, not because she had slept enough, but because the walls of this studio apartment were so thin that one long ringing sound was enough to wake the entire floor. She lay there for exactly 1 more minute in the dark, listening to water drip from the leak in the corner of the ceiling into the plastic bucket she had placed there back in September, silently reminding herself that today was Wednesday, and Wednesday meant one thing she didn't want to think about before the sky had even begun to lighten. She sat up, folded her blanket into a neat square on the sofa bed, and switched on the only lamp in the room. The weak yellow light fell over the small framed photograph beside the hot plate, where the woman in the picture had Sadie's smile and eyes that illness hadn't yet had time to steal on the day the photo was taken. Sadie touched the corner of the frame lightly, the way she did every morning, and said nothing, because after 3 years she had run out of words to say, and only habit remained, and sometimes habit was the only thing that kept a person standing upright. She boiled water, made 1/3 of a teaspoon of instant coffee, carefully saved from a jar nearly scraped to the bottom, then sat on the edge of the sofa with her sneakers in her hands. The glue at the toe of the left shoe had peeled loose again after last night's delivery run, so she took the tube of all-purpose glue from the drawer, squeezed a thin line along the edge of the sole, pressed it tight with her thumb, then wedged the toe of the shoe beneath the table leg so the glue could set while she counted her money again. $11, 1 5, 5 ones, and $1 in loose coins she had gathered from the bottom of her coat pocket. She arranged them into one smooth little stack, tucked them into the smallest compartment of her wallet, and refused to let herself think beyond Friday. In the notebook on the table, the figure of $31,000 lay still like a sleeping animal, swollen from the original $9,400 in hospital bills, through the kind of interest rate that, back then, standing in a hospital hallway with the cost notice in her hand, she had signed without reading the second page all the way through. Easy Capital. The name sounded like a promise, and it turned out to be a trap printed with a logo. At 5:45, she put on her coat, picked up her bag, and instead of going straight down the stairs, she turned toward the door across the hall and knocked 3 soft times, exactly according to their signal. Mrs. Eileen Doherty had been awake for a long time already, 78 years old and stubborn as an old oak tree, sitting in the armchair by the window with a wool blanket spread across her lap. Sadie took the blood pressure monitor from the cabinet, wrapped the cuff around the woman's thin arm, and while they waited for the machine to run, Mrs. Eileen told her about last night's dream, where the late Mr. Doherty had once again forgotten to take out the trash, just as he had throughout 40 years of marriage, and Sadie truly laughed, the first laugh of the day. The numbers were steady. She wrote them down in the little notebook hanging beside the medicine cabinet, then sorted the heart pills into each slot of the weekly pill box. Wednesday, 2 white tablets and 1 pink one, those small pills keeping rhythm for a heart that had been beating for nearly 8 decades. Mrs. Eileen caught Sadie's wrist when she rose to leave, her wrinkled hand warm, and told her, "Child, you're getting too thin. Come over tonight and I'll make soup." Sadie kissed her silver hair and made a promise they both knew would depend on her shift, then went down 4 flights of stairs to the still dark November street. The escape started on the 3rd turn of the key that morning, an improvement, and she drove 15 minutes through Archer Heights as it was waking up, past Polish bakeries that hadn't yet opened their shutters, past rows of 2-story brick houses still dark behind their windows, until she reached the Lakeline Courier Depot at 6:30. And the moment she stepped through the iron gate, she felt it, that thick, heavy air an outsider would never notice, but anyone who worked here knew by heart. The lot was quieter than usual. No one was joking. No one was playing music from a truck cabin the way they did every morning. Drivers stood in small clusters beside their vehicles, checking their routes with a false look of concentration, and everywhere, discreetly enough to be almost invisible, hands were folding money. An older driver named Walt smoothed out 2 20s and 1 10, folded them into quarters, slipped them into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, then patted the pocket lightly as if checking one last time. A blonde woman with her hair tied back named Roxanne was counting change inside her cabin with the door half closed, her lips moving with each number. $50 a week for every truck, steady as a prayer, and today was Wednesday, the day Volkov's men came by. No one called it by its real name. They called it route money, maintenance fees, or simply the Wednesday payment, because to name a thing correctly meant admitting you were on your knees. Sadie walked past the dispatch office, a converted container with frosted glass windows, and saw Dennis Kowalski standing behind his desk, the owner of the company, 58 years old, the man who had built Lakeline from 2 old vans 30 years ago. He saw her too. He saw everything, the hands folding money out there, the silence, the humiliating ritual taking place every week on the very ground that carried his company's name. And like every Wednesday, Dennis Kowalski did the only thing he still knew how to do. He looked away. Once, many months earlier, Sadie had stood in that office and asked him directly how long he intended to let this go on, and he had looked down at the stack of paperwork on his desk, avoiding her eyes, and said in the voice of a man worn down to the core, "Sadie, that's above my pay grade." Above his pay grade. She had heard that sentence enough times to understand what it really meant. It meant we would all lower our heads and hope the price of lowering them didn't rise. Sadie opened the door of delivery truck number 17, the one assigned to her, tossed her bag onto the passenger seat, and began checking the morning route on the scanner, as though today were an ordinary day. But her eyes kept flicking toward the iron gate, where around 1 minute before 8 o'clock, a car would slide in, and the whole lot would hold its breath. She didn't know that today, for the first time in 3 years, the thing that slid through that gate would not be anything anyone at the Lakeline Depot had ever imagined. At 6:45, P.D. Walsh's old bicycle rattled out the iron gate, and Sadie needed only 1 second to know something was wrong. The boy, as she still called him in her mind, even though he was already 21 years old, was usually the only person at this depot still young enough to whistle at dawn. But this morning he leaned his bike against the warehouse wall, with one hand, his head lowered, his knit cap pulled down over his forehead, and when he passed through the crystal glare of a truck idling nearby, Sadie saw it, the dark purple bruise blooming beneath his left eye like a dead flower. She set the scanner down on the seat and crossed the lot before she had time to think. "Petey," she called, and he startled as though he had been caught doing something wrong, half turning away, his fingers tugging the brim of his cap even lower. "I fell," he said before she could even ask, his voice flat like a sentence rehearsed in front of a mirror. "The stairs at my place were slippery because of the rain last night." Sadie stood still and looked at him, saying nothing, only looking, with the gaze she had learned from her mother, a gaze that didn't accuse, didn't press, simply remained there and waited. And beneath that gaze, Petey's lie began to come apart in pieces like glue touched by water. His shoulders sagged. He glanced around the depot, pulled her into the hidden space between two cargo containers, and when he looked up, Sadie saw in his eyes something no 21-year-old should ever have to carry, fear that had survived a sleepless night. "It was Pasha," he said, almost whispering. "Last night he stopped me at the end of my shift, handed me a package, and told me that from now on, twice a week, I'd slip it into my harbor delivery route. No questions about what's inside, no scanning, no paperwork, just deliver it to the address he texts and forget it ever happened." I said, "No, Miss Sadie. I swear I only said I couldn't do it. I needed this job. I didn't want trouble." He touched his fingers lightly to his bruised cheekbone and winced. He said that was the wrong answer. Sadie felt something hot and old rise inside her chest, the feeling she had carried for 3 years at this depot, anger with nowhere to go. She asked whether he had told anyone yet, and Petey seized her wrist so quickly that even he seemed frightened by it, letting go at once, but his eyes were pleading. "Don't, Miss Sadie. Please, if you say anything, I'm finished. I haven't paid this month's rent yet, and if I lose this job, I'm on the street, and you know them. They won't stop at one punch. Just say I fell down the stairs. Please." And Sadie, who had stood in this exact place inside this exact kind of conversation too many times before, knew that pushing him harder would only make him slam shut, so she only nodded slowly and told him to go into the warehouse, get ice from the cooler, and press it to his face before the swelling got worse, and that if anyone handed him anything again, anything at all, he had to come find her first, not afterward, but first. Petey nodded, the nod of a drowning person who had found a plank, then slipped into the warehouse. She remained between the two containers for 10 more seconds, drawing in a deep breath of the biting morning cold, then turned back toward truck 17. At 7:15, she was loading the last parcel into the back of the truck when she heard it, the sound of voices drifting from a hidden corner of the warehouse, where the high racks blocked the view from the office, a young man's voice, sticky and slick, with an Eastern European tone worn rough by Northwest Chicago. And beneath it was Petey's voice, growing smaller and smaller. Sadie didn't decide to walk into the warehouse. Her feet decided for her, just as they had decided for her the night before in a different place. She rounded the row of shelves and saw Pasha Orlov, 26 years old, in a glossy leather jacket and a gold chain, standing with one hand braced against a steel rack, pinning Petey into the corner with nothing but his own shadow. He had come early, alone, not to collect money, but to test the boy's spine, and everyone out in that depot knew he was here and was pretending not to know. "Thought it over yet, kid," Pasha was saying, his voice almost gentle. "I gave you one night for your face to remind you." "Hello," Sadie said, stepping between them as naturally as if she had only come in to get packing tape. But she stopped directly in front of Petey, her back to him, her face turned toward Pasha, and didn't move. "This warehouse is for employees only," she said. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a fist, but her voice came out flat and calm, and that was the only skill 3 years in this place had taught her for free. Pasha looked her up and down, slowly, insolently, then let out a dry little laugh. "Oh," he said, "the delivery girl likes playing hero. I know you." He tilted his head and his smile widened in a way that made Sadie's stomach clench. "You're that Brennan girl who owes us $31,000. He said the number loudly and clearly, each syllable deliberate, meaning for it to carry past the shelves and out into the lot. 31,000, from 9,400 in hospital bills for your old lady. Right. Interest on top of interest grows fast, doesn't it? And a girl drowning in debt up to her neck should learn how to lower her head instead of standing in the way of other people's business." Sadie didn't answer. She knew every reply now would only be kindling thrown into fire, so she simply stood there, holding his eyes, holding her place between him and the boy behind her, and letting silence do its work. For 3 long seconds no one moved, then Pasha clicked his tongue, turned his head and spat onto the concrete floor, one handspan from the glued toe of her shoe, an insult measured carefully enough to stop just short of a line that could be reported to the police. "I'll be back at 8 to collect tax from the whole pack of you," he said, bored with the game now, tugging the collar of his leather jacket back into place and heading toward the gate. "Have the money ready and tell that kid to think fast. My patience is very limited." His footsteps faded, then an engine growled beyond the iron gate, then silence. Behind her, Petey released a trembling breath, whispered his thanks, and Sadie turned to give him a smile she hoped looked steadier than she felt, telling him to get into his truck and start his route early. Everything would be all right. Only after he had disappeared did she allow herself to lean one shoulder against the cold steel rack and hide behind her back, the two hands shaking so badly she couldn't have folded a receipt. 7:30 in the morning, 30 minutes until 8. She had no idea that something else was counting down toward that iron gate too, and it wasn't coming to pay. But to understand what was counting down toward that iron gate, the story must turn back 6 hours, to 1:40 in the morning that same night, when Sadie was still sleeping through the few short hours she had inside her leaking studio apartment, and 10 miles north of there, a black Escalade rolled into the underground level of the tallest glass tower in River North. The driver opened the rear door, lowered the lift, and Cesare pushed his own wheelchair through the private marble lobby, into the private elevator, and up to the highest floor, where the penthouse opened like a nightclub without music, with ceilings nearly 20 feet high, glass running from the floor to the ceiling, and below it all, Chicago smoldering in late-night points of light. He didn't turn on the lights. He had never needed to turn on the lights for nights like this. He rolled to the glass wall, stopped in the exact place where 2 faint wheel tracks had worn into the hardwood floor, and looked down at the city that had carried his family name in every whisper for 3 generations. Today was November 14th. Exactly 2 years. People honored the dead with flowers, with mass, with long banquet tables packed with relatives. But Cesare had sat through all of that in the afternoon, surrounded by wreaths as large as wagon wheels and bowed heads measured by the precise angle of each tilt. And when midnight came, after all of them had gone home, he did the one thing he truly wanted to do. He told the driver to take him to the Blue Star Diner, ordered the whole security team to wait in the car 2 blocks away, and went inside to sit alone in the corner booth. Because 30 years earlier, there had been 2 Falcone boys who used to slip away from the family dinners that felt too tight to breathe in, ride their bikes to that very diner, and order 2 plates of pancakes at midnight, with loose change stolen from their father's coin dish. And the younger one, Gio, the one who laughed before he even understood the whole joke, always claimed the syrup for himself. That was the only place in this city where Cesare could still sit and hear that laughter. Once a year, on this exact night, he went there to eat 1 meal for both brothers. And tonight, for the first time in his life, his black card was declined. He had sat there watching the card reader flash red for the 2nd time, with an outward calm that hid a chain of ice-cold calculations inside. Because his card was never declined, that account had no limit, and the message that appeared on his phone 30 seconds later said only internal security alert, transactions temporarily locked for review. Someone, somewhere inside his own system, had touched his money on the exact night he was alone, with no bodyguard in sight and no cash in his pocket because a man like him hadn't needed to carry cash in 20 years. It could have been a glitch, but Cesare didn't believe in coincidences. Someone inside his system was testing him, yet what occupied his mind most was the young woman from the diner. For 2 years since the ambush that killed his brother and paralyzed his spine, everyone looked at him with pity. But tonight, Sadie Brennan had looked straight into his eyes and treated him as an equal. Cesare turned the glass of liquor in his hand, watching the city lights refract through the crystal, and realized he was thinking about something Gio used to say, the line his younger brother would repeat whenever Cesare mocked the world. "Ches, good people are still out there. They're just too poor for you to see them from up high." At 2:20 in the morning, he set the glass down and picked up his phone. Bruno Santoro answered on the 2nd ring, his voice as alert as if he had never slept, because in 20 years as the right hand of the Falcone family, Bruno had never truly slept. Cesare looked down at the city one last time, toward the south, where the poorer neighborhoods lay sunk in thicker darkness, and said the 6 words that would change was everything that followed. "Find me everything on Sadie Brennan." The other end of the line went silent for exactly 1 beat. Then Bruno asked in his steady professional voice how the last name was spelled. "Boss." "Brenn," Cesare said. "She works for a delivery company, drives an old gray Ford Escape. About 27 years old, and Bruno, I need it before daylight." He ended the call, set the phone on the glass ledge, and sat still in the darkness of the penthouse, not knowing that what Bruno was about to bring back 2 hours later would not simply be the story of a poor woman, but the story of a wound festering on the very territory that carried his family name, and that the name Sadie Brennan was about to become the first match thrown into a powder keg someone had been quietly spreading for the past 2 years. At exactly 3 in the morning, the private elevator gave a soft vibration, and Bruno Santoro stepped into the penthouse with a thin file tucked under one arm, his salt and pepper hair still smooth and orderly, as though the past 2 hours had been nothing more than a stroll instead of a round of waking 6 people across the city. A credit officer who owed the Falcone family a favor, a familiar court clerk, and an information broker on the west side who sold things that never appeared on paper. Bruno set the file on the long black stone table in the middle of the room, switched on the only low lamp, and began speaking in the steady voice with no added or missing emotion, the voice Cesare had trusted for 20 years. Sadie Marie Brennan. 27 years old, born in Bridgeport, father left when she was 4, raised by her mother alone, Colleen Brennan. Laundry worker, died 3 years ago of pancreatic cancer at the county hospital after 8 months of treatment. The hospital bill after insurance was $9,400. She signed a loan agreement with a company called Easy Capital right in the hospital hallway 3 days before her mother died. The nominal interest rate on paper is one thing. The actual interest with penalty fees and extension fees is something else entirely, and as of this month, the debt stands at $31,000, more than tripled in 3 years. She hasn't missed a single minimum payment. Bruno turned to the second page. She has worked as a delivery driver for Lakeline Courier in Archer Heights for 6 years. Clean record, no criminal history, no credit card debt because no bank will issue her a card. Lives in a monthly rental studio on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator, and according to neighbors, for the past 3 years, she has been caring for a 78-year-old woman across the hall for free, taking her blood pressure every morning, buying her medicine out of her own pocket in the months when the old woman's pension runs short. Bruno then turned to the darker side of the file. Boss, the Lakeline depot where she works is being extorted by Easy Capital, the same loan sharks holding her debt. They collect protection money from every driver weekly. This is Arkady Volkov's crew, led by a collector named Pasha Orlov. And boss, this is occurring directly on our territory. Anger came to him the way it always came after that alley, not hot, not loud, but cold and slow like water seeping into the foundation of a house, and when he spoke his voice was lower than usual. Volkov has been loan sharking on our ground for 3 years, 60 drivers, and I hear about it for the first time from a delivery girl who paid $23 for me. He let the sentence hang in the air for a moment. Who is backing him so he dares to do that, Bruno? The question fell onto the stone table and stayed there, unanswered, because no one had the answer yet. But both men in that room understood that this question would not be allowed to die. Cesare rolled to the table, pulled open a drawer, and took out a blank sheet of paper and a fountain pen, the old ritual his father had taught him, that the most important things had to begin by hand, on paper, so the hand would remember the promise even when the mind wanted to forget. He placed the page neatly under the lamp and wrote the first line, Sadie Brennan. The ink strokes dark and decisive, then moved down a line and wrote Lakeline, moved down another line and wrote Volkov, and stopped there, leaving the rest of the page white like a promise not yet fully spoken. Then he looked up. Call everyone, he said. The teams in River North, Cicero, Bridgeport, the South Warehouse Group too. I want 42 cars, black cars, men dressed properly. Not one weapon visible, not one man allowed to raise his voice, in Archer Heights at 7:30, waiting for my signal and mine only. Bruno nodded and began making calls, the first call, the third, the 7th, sleep-thick voices on the other end waking fully when they heard the words Falcone order. And while that was happening, Cesare's own phone rang too. Paulie Greco, the 60-year-old consigliere whose news found him faster than the flu, his voice hoarse with lack of sleep and worry. Cesare, you are planning to send 42 cars to a civilian delivery depot at daylight. Do you understand that if even one gun falls out, if one threat is recorded, the district attorney will have a full organized extortion case wrapped for him in a gift box? Cesare listened to the whole thing patiently, then answered with a sentence Polly would repeat for years afterward. We're only parking, Polly. Parking on a public street isn't a crime. The old man on the other end went silent for several seconds, released the kind of sigh that came from 30 years of giving counsel, then said, at least let me alert the lawyers first. And Cesare answered, already done, 10 minutes ago. At 4:50 in the morning, the confirmations began pouring in, 12 cars from Cicero, 9 from Bridgeport, 11 from the South warehouses, 10 from River North. And all across Cook County, in dark garages and parking lots behind closed restaurants, in nameless alleys, engines woke one after another, not roaring, not rushing, only the low, even growl of 42 black machines, receiving the same order, spreading out from 4 directions and beginning to glide south through the last darkness before dawn, toward a small depot in Archer Heights, where a girl was gluing the sole of her shoe back into place, without knowing that the entire underworld of the city had just turned its axis toward her. At 7:40 in the morning, Sadie was standing at the back of truck 17, checking the last parcel again, when she realized something strange. The street outside the iron gate had stopped making sound, not quiet in the early morning way, but a carved-down kind of silence, as though someone had turned down the volume of all Archer Heights. No more buses hissing at the intersection, no more bakery shutters rolling upward. Even the pigeons that had been perched on the power lines in front of the depot had flown off at some point. She lifted her head from the scanner and saw Walt, the old driver, standing motionless beside his truck, his eyes fixed on the end of the street, and then she heard it, not a roar but a glide, the sound of tires rolling slowly over cold asphalt, low and steady and many, far too many to make sense. The first black SUV appeared at the corner like a block of darkness separating itself from the dark, tinted windows. No markings, moving with the pace of a funeral procession, and right behind it came the second, the third, the seventh. A river of polished black metal, crawling one after another along the depot fence, splitting into 2 branches at the gate, one branch wrapping around the main street, the other circling toward the service road behind the warehouse, and, in less than 3 minutes, with a precision that chilled people more than any shout ever could, every entrance and exit of the Lackline depot had been edged closed by a wall of black cars parked close together like dominoes waiting for an order. Then the doors opened, and dozens of disciplined men in dark suits stepped out, standing silently by their vehicles. Inside the depot, panic erupted as drivers hid and the owner frantically called the police. Sadie stood rooted in the lot, realizing these were not Volkov's loud thugs. This was something older, colder, and far more powerful. Sadie stood rooted in the lot, and one thought kept running circles inside her skull like a trapped mouse. These are not Volkov's men. Volkov's crew drove sports cars with modified exhaust pipes, wore gold, spat on the ground, and laughed too loudly. But these men were silent and polished and disciplined in a way that made Volkov's crew look like children playing pretend. This was something bigger, older, and far colder. Then she saw the lead vehicle, the Escalade parked in the very center of the iron gate like a period at the end of a sentence, the rear door opening, a lift extending out and lowering slowly toward the road. That lift was a wheelchair. Sadie's world stalled for half a beat. The man in the wheelchair wore a long black overcoat, and even from 40 yards away, through the chain-link fence, she recognized those shoulders, that absolute stillness of posture, the way he lifted his head and read an entire building from the ground up. Cesare. The man who had forgotten his wallet at the Blue Star. The man for whom she had paid $23 and told to get home safely. The blood inside Sadie turned to ice water down her spine, and the thought struck not like reasoning, but like a blow. I paid for the wrong man. Oh God, I paid for the wrong man, and he knows where I work. She had never told him the name of her workplace. She was certain she never had. Yet he was here, the next morning, with an army large enough to surround a city hall. And inside Sadie's head, every story she had ever heard about men in suits in this city began rising one after another. Names people only dared to whisper, restaurants with back rooms, people who disappeared. And she had stood between a man like that and an arrogant diner manager. She had touched that world with $23 in tips, and now that world had come looking for her. The truck keys slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the concrete with a dry, sharp sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the breathless depot. And when she bent to pick them up, she realized her hand was shaking so hard she had to grab twice before she caught them. From the distance came the sound of sirens, one, then two, then as though the entire police district were pouring toward a single coordinate. And only a few minutes later, two blue and white patrol cars screeched to a stop at the edge of the ring, their flashing lights washing red and blue across the glossy black cars. The first officer stepped out, one hand resting near his belt, and moved toward the tall man with salt and pepper hair standing beside the Escalade, and through the cold morning air, Sadie caught faint pieces of what he said. "What is all this? I need you people to clear out right now." And the salt and pepper-haired man answered in a voice so calm it was almost courteous. "We're legally parked on a public street, officer. No vehicle is blocking a fire lane. No one is armed. No one has stepped across the boundary of private property. You're welcome to inspect every car if you wish." The officer stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes sweeping along the endless line of vehicles, while the radio on his shoulder crackled with calls for more backup, because the man was right, and both of them knew it. No law in Illinois forbade 42 cars from parking correctly along a public street at the same time, and no law forbade men in suits from standing silently beside their cars on a November morning. Sadie edged behind the back of truck 17, her heart pounding all the way up into her ears, her eyes never leaving the wheelchair that remained motionless in the middle of the gate like the center of a storm holding its breath. And she had no idea that only a few minutes from now, a police officer would walk across this depot, come straight toward her, and say a sentence that would break open all the fear in her chest in a way she could never have seen coming. At 7:55, the young officer broke away from the cluster of confused police, standing at the edge of the ring, crossed through the iron gate into the depot, and every eye at Lackline followed each step he took as though watching a lit match crawling toward a powder magazine. He stopped in the middle of the lot, looked around at the pale-faced drivers hiding behind their trucks, and raised his voice, loud and clear, trying to keep it level though he couldn't quite hide the bewilderment underneath. "I need to find someone named Sadie Brennan. Is there a Sadie Brennan here?" For 3 seconds, no one moved, and Sadie felt 60 pairs of eyes turn toward her all at once like 60 headlights, felt her knees soften, and in that moment she thought about denying it, thought about shaking her head and climbing into the back of truck 17 and locking the door. But then she thought of Petey standing somewhere behind her, with the bruise beneath his eye, thought that if these people had come because of her, then hiding would only push the danger onto everyone around her, so she stepped out from the shadow of the truck and said, "That's me," her voice far thinner than she wanted it to be. The officer came closer, and at such a short distance she saw that he was probably only about her age, with beads of sweat on his forehead in the middle of November. And then he said the sentence the whole depot would later repeat hundreds of times. "Mom, the man in the wheelchair out there is asking to speak with you, only with you. He refuses to explain anything to us except one thing. He says he owes you a debt, and he has come to repay it." Silence fell over the depot like snow. Sadie could hear the blood moving in her ears. A debt, $23. She almost let out a senseless laugh at the insane distance between that amount and the black steel wall now surrounding her workplace. And the fear inside her chest didn't vanish. It changed shape, turning into a dizzying bewilderment mixed with something she didn't dare name, something that felt almost like a strand of hope. Kowalski had rushed out of the container office, his face white as a tax form, clutching at her elbow as he stammered, "Sadie, you don't have to go out there. Nobody can make you go out there. Let the police handle it." And she heard herself answer in a voice strangely calm, "If he wanted to hurt me, he wouldn't need 60 men waiting outside in the sun, Mr. Kowalski. I think I'm the one who started this, so I should be the one to hear how it ends." She walked through the iron gate at 7:57, and the 40 yards from the gate to the Escalade became the longest distance of her life. The 2 rows of men in suits standing along the path didn't look directly at her. They looked straight ahead with perfect discipline, but she could feel their attention the way she could feel heat from a furnace. She heard her glued sneakers strike the pavement as loudly as drum beats, heard the patrol car lights clicking and sweeping behind her, smelled exhaust mixed with leather and cold air, and she kept walking, back straight, chin raised, because her mother had once told her, "Girl, when you are most afraid, you walk like the floor belongs to you." She stopped 3 yards from the wheelchair. There, beneath the daylight, without the buzzing neon light and the smell of frying oil, Cesare looked both like and unlike the man from last night. The black overcoat made his shoulders seem broader. His face still held those carved stone lines, but his eyes, when they caught hers, contained nothing that looked like a threat. They were only quiet and intent, as though in the middle of this whole ring of steel, the only thing he had truly come to see was her. "Miss Brennan," he said, and the fact that he knew her last name dropped another cold stone into her stomach. "Who are you?" she asked, and the question came out more directly than she had meant it to. "Last night, you said your name was Cesare, that was all, and this morning you brought an entire—" She glanced along the wall of black cars, unable to find the right noun. "An entire thing to my workplace, so I think I deserve to know who I'm talking to." The salt and pepper-haired man standing behind the wheelchair, the one who had spoken to the police earlier, cleared his throat softly. But Cesare lifted 2 fingers just slightly, and the man went silent at once. "My name is Cesare Falcone," he said, without emphasis, without waiting for her reaction, like a man setting a heavy object on a table and letting it speak for its own weight. And Sadie felt the name fall into some deep compartment of memory. Newspaper fragments, whispers at gas stations, the surname people spoke at half volume, and her knees had to remind each other to stay straight. "And before you tell me what you're thinking," he continued, his voice carrying just enough for not only her but also the police and the phones recording behind the fence to hear, "I want one thing made clear right here. Not one of my men this morning is carrying a weapon. Not one of them came here to start a war with anyone. Not one of them will set foot through that gate unless invited. We came in peace, and we will leave in peace." He turned his head slightly toward the salt and pepper-haired man. "Bruno, how many cars?" 42, boss," Bruno answered without needing to count, his voice as even as a weather report. "And if that officer asks again, I've already counted for him too." Something very close to a smile passed across the corner of Cesare's mouth and disappeared, and Sadie stood there inside the ring, her heart still pounding like a war drum, but her mind beginning to work again, looking at the most powerful man in Chicago sitting in the wheelchair before her, and asking the only question left after all her fear had burned down. "All right, Mr. Falcone. Then what exactly do you want from me?" And Cesare Falcone looked straight into her eyes, let both hands fall away from the rims of his wheels, and said a sentence no script in Sadie's mind had ever prepared her to hear. But that answer never had a chance to be spoken, because at that exact moment, from the end of the street came the roar of a modified exhaust ripping the silence apart, and an ash-gray sports sedan whipped sharply onto the road in front of the depot, screeching to a stop in the middle of the street, because there wasn't so much as a yard of curb left open for it to pull into, and all 4 doors flew open at once like a badly staged farce. Pasha Orlov got out first, glossy leather jacket, gold chain, followed by 4 henchmen whose faces still looked heavy with sleep, and for the first 5 seconds, none of them understood what was happening. Their feet were still moving on the momentum of 3 years of habit, Pasha's mouth still opening to shout into the depot the familiar line, "Where's the money? All of you. It's 8 o'clock," exactly as he had promised. Exactly like a death clock, he himself had wound up at 7:30 without knowing it. Then he saw. All 5 of them saw it at once, and stopped dead in the middle of the street as though they had struck an invisible wall, their heads turning slowly along the line of black cars, stretching in both directions, along the men in suits standing motionless at perfectly even intervals, and Sadie, from where she stood beside the Escalade, saw the moment truth dropped onto Pasha Orlov's head. She saw his neck stiffen, saw his hand freeze halfway through the movement of pulling at his jacket zipper, saw a 26-year-old man aged 10 years and 3 seconds. Behind the fence, 60 phones had already risen, tiny lenses aimed through the chain link, and the whole lackline depot held its breath behind the warehouse glass. Cesare didn't turn his wheelchair around right away. He let the silence do its work for 3 more heartbeats, then placed both hands on the rims and slowly angled the chair toward the new arrivals. And when he spoke, his voice was no louder than it had been when he spoke to Sadie, but in that morning, drained of every other sound. Each word fell onto the street as clearly as coins dropped on stone. "Pavel Orlov," he said, and the sound of his real name, not his nickname, coming from a stranger's mouth, made the young man jerk as though he had just heard his name called from a death list. 26 years old, collector for the Archer Heights territory. Every Wednesday morning, you walk through that gate and take $50 from every truck, more than 60 trucks, for 3 years now, and counting this morning. You intended to make your 157th collection. Cesare let the number hang in the air. Last night you handed a 21-year-old kid named P.D. Walsh a package and an order, and when the boy refused, you left a bruise on his face that everyone in this depot saw this morning. From behind the warehouse glass, Sadie saw P.D.'s shadow shoot up from his hiding place, both hands gripping the edge of the window. And Miss Brennan here, Cesare went on, his eyes never leaving Pasha, owes your organization $31,000, swollen from $9,400 in hospital bills, for a dead mother, a debt that this morning, inside that warehouse, you read aloud like a sentence to teach her how to lower her head. Pasha swallowed hard, his throat working up and down, and he did the only thing men like him knew how to do when cornered. He puffed himself up. "Who the hell are you?" he said, trying to pump his usual thug swagger into his voice, but the last syllable ran short and betrayed him. "This is our business area. You think you can bring a few cars here and scare anybody?" One of the 4 henchmen behind him, the one who seemed the most awake, had already begun taking small steps back toward the sedan. Cesare tilted his head by the slightest degree, as though Pasha's question were some strange object worth examining. "You know who I am," he said, his voice still flat. "I saw it in your knees the moment you stepped out of the car, but who I am matters less than who you are, Pavel, so let me tell you who you are." He rolled forward exactly 1 yard, only 1 yard, and all 5 young men stepped back half a pace at the same time by instinct, an image captured in full by 60 phones behind the fence. "You are a child who built an entire career on being the most frightening thing in a parking lot full of poor people. The most frightening thing among 60-year-old men who need to keep their jobs to pay for their medicine. The most frightening thing in front of young boys trying to survive on their own, who can't afford to lose a month's wages. The most frightening thing in a place where no one dares look you in the eye for more than 2 seconds. Cesare stopped, and for the first time all morning, something flashed behind the stillness in his eyes, cold and bright as steel. "Look around, kid. Look carefully. You are no longer the most frightening thing here." Pasha looked. He didn't want to look, but his neck turned on its own, along the 42 black cars, past the faces of men standing silent as statues. Men whose silence any street kid in Chicago would understand was worth more than noise. Past the police standing at the edge with their arms crossed, and no look at all of coming to his aid. Past the 60 phone cameras recording every bead of sweat on his temple. And Sadie witnessed with her own eyes the moment she would remember for the rest of her life. The moment a bully saw himself reflected in the mirror of real power and broke apart. "Let's go," Pasha said to his men, his voice having dropped a full octave. "We're leaving." He backed toward the car, trying to salvage one last sentence over his shoulder. "This isn't over," the line losers in every age always said, and it sank into the silence without a single echo. 4 doors slammed shut, the ash-gray sedan snarled backward, turned around clumsily in 2 moves on the narrow street, then shot away, leaving behind a smear of exhaust smoke that quickly dissolved in the cold air. Half a second of silence, then the Lackline depot exploded. Cheering burst from behind the warehouse doors like a broken dam. Walt pounded both fists on the roof of his truck cabin and shouted something no one could make out. Roxanne was crying and laughing in the driver's seat. Petey rushed out of the warehouse door and stood in the middle of the lot, tipping his face up to the sky and breathing as though he had just been pulled above water. An applause spread from the depot all the way to the crowd gathering behind the fence, even reaching a few young police officers who had to bite the inside of their cheeks to keep their faces serious. In the middle of all that sound, Sadie stood still, watching 3 years of humiliation at a depot evaporate in 20 minutes without one drop of blood being spilled, and she heard Cesare speak softly, almost only to her, or perhaps to himself. "A bully is only as big as the silence around him, Miss Brennan." For 3 years' Place was only missing one person brave enough to break that silence. And last night, in a diner, I sat and watched that person do it for $23. He turned his wheelchair back toward her, and now there was a real question in his eyes. "Now, with your permission, I'd like 10 minutes of your time, only to talk," And afterward, whatever your answer is, these 42 cars will leave your street before 9 o'clock. Sadie looked at him, looked at the man who had overturned the whole order of her world for the past 3 years with a voice no louder than the wind. And she had no idea that the next 10 minutes would hold an offer that would shake her harder than all 42 of those cars combined. At 8:30, they sat in the farthest corner of the depot, at the faded, oil-stained wooden table the drivers still used for lunch on sunny days. Sadie on the bench, Cesare in his wheelchair across from her, and Bruno standing about 50 feet away, far enough not to hear anything, close enough to see everything. While outside, the police had begun to spread out because they couldn't find a single parking violation, and inside the yard, the drivers were pretending to be busy in the clumsiest way in the history of courier work. Before she could say anything, Cesare spoke first. I need you to know something, and you aren't going to like it. Last night, after you left the diner, I had people look into you. By 3 o'clock this morning, I knew your full name, knew you grew up in Bridgeport, knew about your mother, about the 8 months at the county hospital, about the signature in the hallway on the 3rd floor, about the number in the notebook you carry with you. Even knew that for the past 3 years, every morning, you've been taking the blood pressure of an old woman who isn't related to you. He said all of it in an even voice, without looking away, his eyes never leaving hers, and Sadie felt her skin go cold, inch by inch with every sentence, the naked feeling of someone who had just discovered that the windows of her life had no curtains. You had me investigated, she said slowly, because I paid for your meal. Yes. Don't you think that's excessive? Yes, Cesare answered without blinking, and I won't apologize for it, because in my world, not knowing the person who helped you is carelessness, and careless people in my world don't live long. I could lie to you and say I regret it, but I think you're the kind of person who would rather hear an unpleasant truth than a polished apology. Sadie looked at him for a long while, and what unsettled her most was that he was right. She truly would rather have it that way. Fine, she said. Then tell me what you want to say, Mr. Falcone, because I still have 16 deliveries to make before noon. Something faint passed at the corner of his eyes, something that on another man might have been a smile. At 7 o'clock this morning, he said, my lawyers sent the first offer to the true owners of Easy Capital through 3 layers of intermediaries. We are buying out their entire loan portfolio in this area, contract by contract, legally notarized, and once the transaction is complete, every debt in that portfolio will be mine to decide, including one contract under the name Sadie Marie Brennan, valued at $31,000. He let one beat pass, and I intend to tear it up. The world around Sadie tilted slightly. $31,000. The sleeping animal in her notebook. 3 years of bending her back under it, nights lying awake calculating interest until 2 in the morning. The iron ring tightened around every large and small decision in her life. From the popsicle she didn't dare buy to the wisdom tooth she didn't dare have pulled. All of it gone in one motion of tearing paper by the man in front of her. She heard the blood pounding in her ears, heard a voice inside her scream, "Take it, you idiot. Take it and get on your knees and thank him." And she sat still, both hands locked together on the wooden table, until that voice quieted enough for her to hear another one, smaller and older, the voice of the woman in the frame beside the hot plate. "No," she said. Cesare went motionless. "No," Sadie repeated, more clearly, "and thank you. I mean that, but no." In 20 years, the man sitting across from her had heard people say every possible thing when faced with his money, begging, bargaining, weeping, swearing, betraying, but never, not once, had he heard this word, and Sadie saw it happen right in front of her, saw true shock pass over that carved stone face, only for an instant but real, like the first crack across the surface of a frozen lake. "Why?" he asked, and for the first time that morning, his voice carried a note that hadn't been planned in advance. "Because last night I paid $23, Sadie said, "and I didn't pay it to buy anything. If I accept $31,000 this morning, then those $23 aren't kindness anymore. They become an investment, the most profitable investment in the history of Chicago." She shook her head. "I don't exactly live a beautiful life, Mr. Falcone, but I have one thing left that no one has taken from me, and that is when I give something, it's free. My mother died in debt, but she never owed anyone for a kindness, and I don't intend to become the first person in this family to break that tradition. That debt is mine. I signed it with my own hand. I'll pay it with my own hand. Silence stretched between them, and this time Cesare was the first to look away, his eyes turning toward the wall of black cars outside as though he didn't see them at all. And when he looked back, something in the way he saw her had been rearranged forever. Then another offer, he said, his voice returning to the rhythm of business. My family owns a restaurant chain, legal, tax-paying, audited. You can have your lawyer look at every sheet of paper if you have a lawyer. And that chain needs a transport coordinator. Someone to arrange food and supply routes for 9 locations. The pay is twice what you make here. The hours are human, health insurance from day one. Not a gift, he added when he saw her open her mouth, but an open position and a person with 6 years of field coordination experience. You'll have to work, and if you do badly, the manager will fire you like anyone else. I promise you he isn't that afraid of me. Sadie almost laughed, and she hated herself a little for it. Let me think, she said. Cesare nodded, not pressing, then took from the inside pocket of his overcoat a business card printed with only one phone number and no name, placed it on the wooden table, and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. She picked it up, turned it over and back again, then asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since 7:40. Why, Mr. Falcone? That's a real question. I know who you are now, and a man like you doesn't bring 42 cars to repay a breakfast. You could have sent flowers. You could have sent a check. Why all of this? Cesare was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer, both hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, and when he spoke slowly, as though each word had been taken from a place that was seldom opened. For 2 years, Miss Brennan, I have sat in this chair, and I have learned something no school teaches, that the whole world looks at me and sees the chair first, the man afterward, if they still care to look as far as the man. Enemies see old prey. My people see a symbol that must be preserved, doctors see a case, and good people, the kindest people, they see someone to pity, and pity, believe me, is the coldest gaze of all. He looked up, and for one moment the most powerful man in Chicago let her see exactly what lay behind those guarded eyes. Last night, you walked to that counter because a stranger was being humiliated, and when you turned and looked at me, you were the first person in 2 years who saw a man before seeing the wheelchair. You have no idea what that is worth, Miss Brennan. But I do, and I always pay the proper price. He rolled his chair back by one small measure, the polite closing gesture of their conversation like a bow, and said before turning away, the number on that card rings a phone that only 3 people in this world have the number 2, now 4. Don't lose it. And Sadie remained alone at the oil-stained wooden table, the white business card held between her still cold fingers, watching the 42 black cars start one by one and leave her street exactly as promised, without knowing that the list of 4 people was about to become the ticket that pulled her into a world whose entrance was wide open, and whose exit had to be paid for with something far more expensive than money. 3 weeks passed, and the Lakeline Depot learned how to breathe again. On the first Wednesday morning after the black morning, the whole lot held still and waited until 8 o'clock, then 8:15, then 9, and not a single ash-gray sedan appeared, not that week, not the next week, not ever again. Only one black SUV parked modestly across the street every morning, from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, the driver sitting inside reading a newspaper. Speaking to no one, looking at no one for too long, a coincidence repeated so steadily that Walt began waving to it every morning as though greeting a coworker. Petey came back to work with the bruise fading, and his shoulders growing a little straighter each week, and eventually he even started whistling in the lot again. As for Sadie, after 4 days of picking up the white business card and putting it down again, she dialed the number, went to an interview with a manager named Aldo, who asked her real questions about routes and cold chains and rush hours, and hired her for the transport coordinator position at a salary that made her read the offer sheet twice in the parking lot. In the second week, she bought her first new pair of shoes in 3 years, the kind with soles stitched in place instead of glued, and that night she sat beside Mrs. Eileen eating soup, telling her about the new job, and the old woman laughed and said, "See, didn't I tell you this winter would be different?" Then on Friday afternoon of the 3rd week, the phone whose number only 4 people had rang, and the familiar low voice on the other end said without preamble, "Miss Brennan, I owe you a meal. Are you free tomorrow night?" And when she asked where he planned to take her, some 3-star restaurant, surely she heard, for the first time, something almost playful in Cesare Falcone's voice. I think we both know there is only one proper place for this meal." At 7 o'clock Saturday evening, the Escalade parked in front of the Blue Star Diner, and when Cesare rolled through the glass door with Sadie walking beside him, Gary Hutchins's face behind the counter took a complete journey from healthy pink to chalk white, and then to a gray-green shade Medicine had perhaps not yet named. For the past 3 weeks, he must have watched the videos spreading across the city, must have realized that the man in the wheelchair in those videos was the very customer whose card he had once flicked into his lap, and now that man was sitting in the same old corner booth, calm as if coming home. Gary brought the water himself, both hands carrying the tray trembling so badly the ice clinked against the glasses, stammering his welcome, and saying that tonight the diner would like to offer dessert on the house. And throughout that meal he kept hovering back and forth, wiping tables that were already spotless within a radius close enough for repentance, and far enough to avoid trouble. Lorna brought the menus, and when she placed one in front of Sadie, she winked at her in exactly the same way she had that night, then said softly, "Honey, your coffee in this diner is free for life, new policy, issued tonight." They ordered, and he ordered the exact pancake plate, even though it was dinner time, and when Sadie raised an eyebrow, he looked down at the plate for a while and told her, in the voice of a man, opening a door that was rarely opened, that 30 years earlier there had been 2 boys who used to sneak out of the house and ride their bikes here at midnight. The older brother ordered. The younger brother claimed the syrup, and the younger one's name was Gio, who laughed before he understood the whole joke, loved everyone, and was loved by everyone in return, who could soften every negotiation table simply by walking into the room. "The night you met me here," he said, "was the 2-year anniversary of his death. I came to eat for both of us." And he told her nothing more about the night Gio died. He didn't need to. His eyes had told the rest. Instead, he told her about the months afterward, when he had to learn everything again. And the hardest part wasn't learning to use his hands in place of his legs. The hardest part was learning to stand without standing. Do you understand? My whole life I was taught that Falcone men overwhelmed a room with height, with the way they walked. And then one morning I woke up and all of that was gone, and I had to find a way to make a room go silent while sitting lower than everyone in it. It took me a year, he said, to understand that power had never been in the knees. It was in being the calmest person in the room. Sadie listened, forgetting to eat, and when it was her turn, she told him what she had never told anyone. About the 8 months at the county hospital. About the smell of disinfectant that clung to her sweater and couldn't be washed out. About the 3rd-floor hallway, where a man in a cheap suit with an easy capital file had come looking for her. Not the other way around. Exactly 3 days before her mother died. Exactly when she was at her most exhausted and fogged with grief. As though people like them had radar that could detect the scent of desperation. And she had signed, because at that moment a signature was the only thing she still had left to give. "My mother woke for the last time that night," she said, "and the last thing she said to me wasn't, 'I love you.' It was, 'Sadie, don't let life turn you into someone who keeps score.'" She smiled, a downward curving smile. "For 3 years I've been paying interest on that sentence in the most literal way, and the strange thing is, I haven't regretted it for a single day." Cesare looked at her across the table for a very long time and said softly, "Then she won because life hasn't managed it." There was a moment, when Lorna came to refill the coffee, and they both reached to move their cups. When their fingers paused less than a finger joint apart on the Formica tabletop, close enough that Sadie could feel the warmth from his hand, and neither of them pulled back for 2 long seconds that felt like an entire season. Then Lorna finished pouring. The moment closed. Both hands returned to their places, but something in the air between them did not return to where it had been. They talked until the diner held only the 2 of them, and the familiar buzz of the neon lights, about Bridgeport and River North. About how he had never pumped his own gas and she had never been on an airplane. 2 lives with not a single thing in common except for one thing. They both knew exactly what it felt like to be looked at by the whole world and still not be seen. And Sadie realized, somewhere between the 10th story and the 4th cup of coffee, that she was laughing more than she had laughed in all of the past year combined. She didn't know that before this very night, before that cup of coffee even had time to go cold, she would see the other half of this man, the half the whole city feared, and that the boundary between their two worlds was about to remind her it had always been there, sharp as a freshly honed blade. Sadie's fourth cup of coffee was still steaming when the door of the Blue Star Diner opened, pulling in a rush of cold air, and Bruno Santoro stepped inside, not hurried, not breathless, but the way he walked straight to the corner booth without even glancing at a menu said everything. Because men like Bruno never appeared, for no reason, they appeared only when they were needed. He bent beside Cesare's shoulder, one hand held lightly near his mouth, and whispered for no more than 10 seconds, and Sadie, sitting across from them, witnessed something very few people in the world had ever witnessed from such close range, a transformation. The man who only moments earlier had been telling stories about fighting his younger brother for the syrup, the man whose fingers had paused one finger joint away from hers on the tabletop, vanished within a single breath. No anger flared, no fist clenched. It was only that all the warmth on his face withdrew somewhere, like water draining from a sandbar, leaving behind a flat, cold surface, and his eyes, when they lifted from the table, were no longer the eyes that had looked at her for the past 3 hours. They were the eyes of something, made to issue decisions ordinary people didn't dare imagine. And in the half-second those eyes swept across where she sat, Sadie felt her spine go icy, as though someone had pressed a strip of metal against the back of her neck, even though she knew for certain, that look wasn't meant for her. Cesare blinked, and the curtain closed. He turned toward her with his face rearranged into something almost perfect, only his jaw still tight, and said in a low, even voice that had lost all its trace of playfulness, "Miss Brennan, I am sincerely sorry, but there is something that can't wait until morning. Bruno will call a car to take you all the way home, and he stopped for one beat, as though the next sentence was a turn he didn't want to take. I have to go back to being the man I have to be." He didn't wait for her answer, only gave one short nod, polite and distant, like that first morning at the depot, then pushed his wheels toward the door, and Sadie remained alone in the booth with 2 cups of coffee slowly going cold, staring through the window glass into the dark parking lot, where the Escalade was already idling, and 3 men she had never seen before were somehow waiting beside it. The diner door hadn't closed all the way, and the night wind carried in one torn piece of conversation, the voice of one of those 3 men, urgent and restrained, he confessed. "He has been selling route information to outsiders for 3 months. We've already handled his part. Now we're only waiting for you to decide the rest." And then Cesare's voice, so low she almost felt it through the floor more than heard it, spoke exactly 4 words, "Not here." And the car door closed, swallowing the rest of that world whole. "We've already handled his part." Those 4 words followed Sadie into the car Bruno called for her, followed her through the 20-minute ride home in silence, followed her up 4 flights of stairs, and lay down with her on the sofa bed in the dark studio apartment, where she kept her eyes open on the spreading stain across the ceiling and let her mind do the thing she had been postponing for 3 weeks. What did handled mean in that man's world? She had watched the videos from the depot, had heard the name Falcone fall onto the street like a heavy object, had searched his name on her old phone one sleepless night, and read articles that used phrases like suspected, insufficient evidence, witness recanted, and she had folded all of that away, tucked it into a compartment, because the man who told stories about pancakes with those weary eyes seemed to belong to a different truth. But tonight the 2 truths had sat in the same booth, and she had seen the moment one truth relieved the other, smooth and cold as a folding blade. She thought about the hand that had paused one finger joint from hers, and thought that that same hand, tonight, would sign a decision over a human being's fate with 4 words, "Not here." She pressed her face into the pillow, and the question appeared in the darkness behind her eyelids, bare, unavoidable. Not the question of whether he would hurt her, but when, because his world was built from debts and prices, and sooner or later, one way or another, that world would send her the bill. At the same time, 4 floors and 1 layer of car glass away, the Escalade sat motionless across the dark street, and Cesare sat in the back seat. The other matter had been arranged, the calls had been made, but he hadn't told the driver to leave yet. He had told him to circle here first, just 1 minute, and now he sat looking up at the 4th floor window, where the weak yellow light had just gone out, and the man who had never known fear in front of any gun barrel realized that he was afraid, not afraid for himself, because that fear had been buried in the alley 2 years ago, but afraid with a brand new, clumsy fear, one that had no name in any dictionary of his world. The fear that the only warm light he had found in 2 years might also be the very thing his hands, simply by touching it, would put out. She saw it tonight, he knew. He had seen the shiver she tried to hide. Bruno, sitting in the front seat, watched his boss through the rearview mirror and said nothing, because 20 years had taught him when silence was the highest form of loyalty. Cesare looked at the dark window for one more breath, then said softly, "Go," and the black car glided away without a sound, carrying the man who had won every game of his life except the one he had just realized he wanted to play most, while never knowing that in another hidden corner of the city, tonight, someone else was awake too. Someone else was looking toward Archer Heights, and beginning to follow the same stream of money Cesare was about to follow, only from the other end of the line. 3 days later, the file the Falcone lawyers and forensic accountants had compiled on Easy Capital had thickened into a stack of paper, and Cesare sat with it all evening in the penthouse study, peeling back layer after layer of that company the way a person might peel a rotten onion. The outer layer was simple. Easy Capital LLC was registered in Illinois. The director on paper was a third-rate lawyer who specialized in lending out his name. Behind it was the parent company Meridian Lending Group, registered in Delaware, the state where 1,000 shell companies could share the same mailbox. And behind Meridian was a private fund called Harbor Point Holdings, also in Delaware, owned by 2 other entities whose trail faded like smoke. Whoever had built this structure was good, very good. But there was one rule Cesare's father had taught him, before he even knew how to tie a necktie. Money could change its name as many times as it wanted, but in the end it always had to flow into a real pocket, and that pocket always left a mark. That mark arrived on the 4th day, through an old accountant who owed the Falcone family a favor from his father's time, the man who traced out that Harbor Point Holdings. 3 years earlier, had been seeded with $2 million from the sale of an old parking lot in Cicero. And that parking lot, Cesare read the line once, twice, 3 times, had once belonged to a portfolio of assets the family had entrusted for 20 years to one manager, Carmine Rizzo. The room went so quiet that Cesare could hear the second hand of the desk clock. He sat motionless for a very long time, then did what a less disciplined man wouldn't have been clear-headed enough to do. He did not summon anyone. He did not break anything. He took another sheet of paper and began writing down every fact, separating emotion from evidence, as though reconstructing a crime scene. Fact 1, Carmine Rizzo, underboss, his father's right hand before he became Cesare's right hand, was the hidden source of money behind the loan sharking operation, bleeding Falcone territory dry, and that explained why Volkov had dared to operate for 3 years without asking permission, without paying a share, without even hiding it. He had been paying. He had simply been paying to a different address. Fact 2, and Cesare's hand slowed as he wrote this line, the night in the alley behind Vecchio's restaurant 2 years ago. The schedule had been changed at the last minute, and only 3 people knew the new route: Cesare, Gio, and the man who had arranged security for that meeting, Carmine Rizzo. A truth he had pushed aside for 2 years because suspecting Rizzo felt no different from suspecting the foundation beam of the house. The police concluded it was an outside gang, a botched hit, file closed, no one arrested, no one. Cesare stared at those 2 words on the paper. No one. Fact 3, and this piece dropped into place with a click that was almost audible, the internal security alert that had locked all his accounts on the night at the Blue Star Diner. The family bank report clearly stated that the review order had been triggered from the Internal Financial Oversight Office. The office that, according to the organizational chart Cesare himself had signed 3 years earlier, fell directly under Carmine Rizzo's authority. He had been watching Cesare's money, controlling every financial movement he made, and that night, whether by accident or by design, he had pulled the trigger on a test whose result was that a strange woman walked up and paid $23. Cesare set the pen down. At 3 a.m, he rolled his chair through the dark penthouse to the bookcase in the corner, pulled out an old leather-bound album worn soft at the edges, and turned to the photograph he knew exactly which page to find. A picture taken 25 years earlier at the family hunting lodge in Wisconsin. 12-year-old Cesare holding a rifle almost as tall as he was. Beside him 8-year-old Gio grinning with both hands clapped over his ears, and standing behind them both, one hand resting on the older boy's shoulder, was a very young 23-year-old Carmine Rizzo. The man who had knelt behind him that whole afternoon, adjusting his posture by inches. Tuck the stock into the hollow of your shoulder, kid. Breathe all the way out before you squeeze. The boy's Uncle Carmine. The man who had sat in the front pew at Gio's baptism. The man who had carried one corner of Gio's coffin. The man who, for the past 2 years, every Sunday night, had still sat on Cesare's right side at the family table, poured wine for him, raised a glass to the memory of his brother, and looked him straight in the eye. Cesare sat with the photograph in his palm until dawn began to pale the sky, and the only thing that moved on his face was one small muscle in his jaw. The next morning, Polly Greco came when summoned, listened to all of it, studied the whole stack of paper, and the old consigliere sank into a chair as though the bones had been pulled out of him, muttering a stream of Italian that was half prayer, then looked up with eyes that had seen 4 decades of blood and betrayal. Cesare, listen to me. What you have is a money trail and inference, not proof. No witness, no recording, no document carrying Carmine's signature. And Carmine Rizzo isn't some pasha off the street. Half the capos in this family were raised by his hand. You move against him now, without proof, and by tomorrow morning, half the family will believe the nephew in the wheelchair has finally gone mad with suspicion, and the other half will start sharpening knives. This isn't a handling, this is civil war. The entire family will split in 2. I know, Cesare said, and he had known since 3 in the morning. Then what are you going to do? Nothing, Cesare answered, and before Polly's stunned stare, he explained in the flat voice that had become his most frightening weapon. We're going to do nothing. I'll have Sunday dinner this week like every Sunday. I'll let him pour my wine. I'll smile at him. He has been patient for 2 years. I can be more patient than that, because every traitor has the same weakness, Polly. They can't stand seeing their prey look happy. Sooner or later he'll have to move, and when he moves, he'll hand us himself the one thing we haven't had for 2 years, proof. And that same night, on the other side of the city, in the back room of a private club on the north side, a 58-year-old man with silver hair combed back and a gold ring on his pinky sat through cigar smoke as a younger man delivered a report. Sir, something happened in Archer Heights. Volkov lost the whole area. Falcone brought in 42 cars, didn't spend 1 bullet, and there's more. Our people say he's been spending time with some girl, the delivery girl who paid for him at that diner that night. He has a car watching her building, gave her a job, personally took her to dinner. Carmine Rizzo listened to all of it without interrupting, slowly turning a glass of red wine beneath the low light, then smiled a slow smile that made the man giving the report instinctively take half a step back, and said in a voice as smooth as velvet, the voice that had lulled an entire family to sleep for 2 years. How interesting. For 2 years I've been trying to break whatever is left of that boy, and couldn't find the joint. Turns out he grew one himself. He took a sip of wine. Write this down, boys. If you want to break a man who has already been broken, don't aim at him. That's useless. He has no place left to break. Aim at the thing he has just begun to love. The following week began with things so small that it took Sadie 3 days to allow herself to call them unusual. On Monday, during a delivery inspection route for a restaurant in Pilsen, she noticed a wine-colored sedan parked at an angle across the street for the full 20 minutes she was working. Dark windows, engine running, no one getting out, and when she left, it rolled away too. A coincidence, she told herself. This city had thousands of wine-colored sedans. But on Wednesday that same car, which she recognized by the small dent on the front bumper, appeared on the other side of the city, parked half a block from her delivery stop in Lincoln Park. And those 2 delivery points had nothing in common except one thing, her. Sadie sat in her car that day longer than she needed to, both hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the sedan through the rearview mirror until it glided away, and the old feeling from 3 years at the depot crawled back up her spine, the feeling of being marked. On Thursday night, her old phone, not the phone whose number only 5 people had, rang at 11 o'clock, an unknown number, and when she answered, there was no one on the other end, only breathing, steady, patient, lasting exactly 15 seconds before the call ended. And when she called back, the operator said the number did not exist. But the thing that truly made Sadie's hands go cold came on Friday morning, when she brought the sorted heart pills over to Mrs. Eileen, and the old woman, pouring tea, said in the cheerful, innocent voice of an elderly person with a visitor, "Oh, child, Yesterday, such a nice young man came and knocked on my door, said he was a building survey worker, asked how long I'd lived here, what the neighbors were like, and then he asked specifically about you, that brown-haired girl across the hall, what kind of work she does, what her hours are, whether she has visitors often. He was so polite, I told him everything. Nothing to hide, right? Sadie stood in the small kitchen, warm with the smell of tea, hearing the blood rush in her ears, and it took one full breath before she could keep her voice normal enough to ask, "Mrs. Eileen, what did he look like?" And the old woman frowned as she tried to remember. Young, dark blonde hair, gray coat. Oh, but it was strange, wasn't it? What kind of building survey doesn't ask anything about my leaking ceiling? That afternoon, Sadie dialed the number on the phone whose number only 5 people in the world had, and Cesare answered on the first ring. She told him everything. The wine-colored sedan twice on opposite sides of the city, the breathing phone call, the fake survey worker asking about her hours, and she heard the silence on the other end in a way 3 weeks of knowing him had taught her how to read. It wasn't the silence of someone surprised. It was the silence of someone fitting a new piece into a picture that already existed. "Miss Brennan," he said at last, his voice calm in a carefully constructed way, "I'll take care of this. Starting tonight, my people will be near you and the old woman. You won't see them, but they'll be there. Go about your life as usual. Don't change your routes, don't change your hours, and if you see that car again, don't look at it for more than 1 second." Sadie tightened her grip on the phone. "Cesare, who is following me, and why?" One beat of silence. "It could be what's left of Volkov's people trying to test you," he said, and every word was reasonable, every word could have been true, and Sadie, who had spent 6 years listening to every kind of lie at a depot, recognized instantly the unnatural smoothness of the answer, like a stair polished too slick. "You know something you aren't telling me," she said, not as a question. "I know many things I don't tell you, Sadie," he answered, using her first name for the first time, "and that is how I keep those things from touching you." After he hung up, she sat for a long time beside the window, looking down at the dark street, where half an hour later a familiar black SUV pulled into a shadowed corner and parked, just as he had promised, and she realized she was feeling 2 opposite things at once, safer and farther from him, because being protected by a wall and being kept outside that wall, it turned out, felt exactly the same. And across the city, after setting the phone down, Cesare sat motionless in his study for a while, then called Bruno in and said, "They've started. Faster than I expected. Double the people around her and the old woman, completely discreet, and Bruno, it's time to release the canary." They had prepared that plan 3 days earlier, simple and classic the way all effective traps were. Cesare had a confidential internal memo drafted about the family's supposed quiet takeover of the operating rights to a new bonded warehouse at the South Harbor by the end of the month, information that was entirely fabricated because no such warehouse existed, and that memo was placed by hand through exactly one channel, the internal financial reporting channel that passed through the oversight office of only one man in the family. If this information grew wings and flew out, it could only fly from one cage. 48 hours later, the West Side information broker, who still sold intelligence to the Falcone family and to anyone else who paid enough, sent word, through Bruno's private line, that Arkady Volkov's people had started asking questions about a new bonded warehouse at the South Harbor and wanted to know who Falcone intended to put in charge of operations. Bruno placed the report on the black stone table without saying a word, and Cesare looked at it for a very long time, the final confirmation cold and clear as an ink stain. The information had traveled from his page, through exactly one stop, into the enemy's ears in 48 hours. The canary had sung, and the cage had a name. It still wasn't proof for a court. Polly was right, still not something that could be placed on the Sunday dinner table. But it was enough for Cesare to know for certain whom he was playing chess against, and enough to understand that the other side's next move would not be aimed at the harbor, not at the money, but at the very new weakness that the whole underworld now knew was real, except that he and Bruno, the 2 most careful minds in Chicago, were both making the same mistake. They thought they still had time. The phone call came at 10:40 on Saturday night, while Sadie was folding clothes in her studio apartment, and Walt's voice on the other end was shaking so badly, it took her 3 seconds to put the words together into meaning. "Sadie, it's Petey. They found him in the alley behind his place. God, he was beaten to pieces. The ambulance just took him to Rush Medical. Girl, hurry. She didn't remember how she got down 4 flights of stairs, didn't remember on which turn of the key the escape finally started. Only remembered that rain began falling against the windshield, somewhere along the way, and the old wipers squealed in rhythm like a groan. And then she was standing beneath the cold white lights of the emergency department at Rush, listening to an attending doctor say scattered words: concussion, 3 ribs, fractured left orbital socket, lucky it wasn't. And she looked through the gap in the curtain at the hospital bed where Petey Walsh lay, 21 years old, his face wrapped in bandages with only one swollen eye and split lips left visible, both scraped hands resting on the blue blanket like 2 dead birds, and something inside Sadie's chest broke with a sound she could almost hear. He woke close to midnight, and when he saw her, his one remaining eye filled with tears, and he spoke through his torn lips, slowly, distorted but clear, as though he had practiced the words while delirious. Miss Sadie. There were 3 of them. Pasha was there. They didn't steal anything, didn't ask anything. They just beat me, and before he left, Pasha bent down and said in my ear, "You go tell that delivery girl that Falcone's umbrella only covers her, and the rest of you, the ones standing near her, your target practice. Make sure she understands that her friends will pay for her one by one." Petey caught her hand in his scraped fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I don't understand what I did wrong." And it was that sentence, not the blood, not the bandages, it was that sentence, "I don't understand what I did wrong," spoken by a 21-year-old kid who had never harmed anyone, that tore Sadie clean in half. Cesare arrived at 12:20. She hadn't called him. His invisible guards must have reported it. And when the wheelchair appeared at the far end of the emergency hallway with Bruno striding behind him, Sadie was standing in the waiting area, wet from the rain, both hands still marked with streaks of antiseptic, and she watched him come toward her with the face of a man who already knew, already had every detail, already held 3 plans in his mind. And all she saw in that moment were the 42 black cars, the 2 rows of silent suits, the glittering deadly world that had crawled after her all the way here, all the way to the hospital bed of a boy whose only sin had been standing beside her. "Sadie," he began, and she cut him off in a voice she didn't recognize, low and broken. "Don't." He stopped his chair. The hallway was empty, with only the beeping of machines behind closed doors and rain striking the glass at the end of the corridor. "He's 21 years old," she said. "He reads books on his lunch break. He calls me miss like I'm his teacher. And tonight 3 grown men beat his face in, not because he owed anyone, not because he did anything, but to send a message. And do you know who that message was for? It was for me, about you." Her voice broke completely on the final word, and she didn't care. "You said you were protecting us. You put cars outside the depot, put men watching my building, watching Mrs. Eileen, and I was stupid enough to feel safe. But look, Cesare." She pointed toward the gap in the curtain, her whole arm trembling. "Your protection isn't a shield, it's a target. You said you were protecting us, but your name is the thing that painted a bullseye on that boy's back. Not Volkov, not Pasha, the name Falcone, the fact that I stood close enough to you for the whole underworld of this city, to treat the people around me like chess pieces to use against you." Cesare sat motionless, both hands resting on the arms of his chair, and he said nothing, not one word, because he could argue against anything in the world except the truth. And what she had just said was half true, the most painful half. And he knew who had given the green light for this beating and why, knew this was a move aimed at him through her, and saying that out loud now would only trade one excuse for another. The boy behind the curtain was still lying there with his face bandaged because he had stood too close to her light, and her light had stood too close to his darkness. Sadie took the restaurant chain employee badge from her coat pocket, the badge she had pinned to her chest every morning for the past 3 weeks with a happiness she hadn't dared name, and placed it on his lap gently, firmly, like laying down something that had died. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice emptied of tears, emptied even of anger, leaving only exhaustion. "I truly mean that, thank you. But we're done. Don't call me again. Don't have people follow me anymore. My world is poor, leaking, and in debt, but no one bleeds because they stand beside me. I want that world back." Then she turned and walked toward Petey's hospital room, and she didn't look back, so she didn't see the most powerful man in Chicago sitting alone in the middle of the hospital hallway beneath the pale fluorescent lights, with the employee badge on his lap, unmoving for so long that a nurse passing by had to ask, "Sir, "Do you need help?" And he only shook his head. The Escalade remained parked in the hospital lot for 3 more hours, rain whipping white across its roof, and Bruno sat in the front seat without turning on the music, without asking questions, only glancing now and then through the mirror at the man in the back seat who was looking up at the lit windows of the emergency department, both hands clenched on his thighs, hands that could move an army with a single phone call and could do nothing at all, for the 2 people he most wanted to shelter tonight. And Sadie. Near dawn, when she came home soaked and hollow, found Mrs. Eileen's door already open, the old woman sitting in her armchair with 2 cups of tea prepared, and Sadie sank onto the rug beside her feet like a child, told her everything, and cried, the sobs she had held back from the hospital hallway, from the past 3 years, perhaps from that old 3rd-floor hallway in the county hospital too. And Mrs. Eileen gave no advice at all, only stroked Sadie's wet hair with her wrinkled hand, waited until the crying softened, then said slowly and clearly, like a woman who had lived 78 years and knew exactly what she was saying, "Girl, listen to me. People don't get to choose the world they're born into. They only get to choose who they are inside it. And that young man in the wheelchair, that night in the diner, he didn't choose to need your help. But every night after that, child, he chose to come because of you." Sadie lifted her head to answer, but the old woman was already looking out the window, where rain was still falling over the dark street that no longer had any black car parked on it, and neither of the 2 women knew that the very emptiness outside that window, the empty space Sadie had just asked for with her own mouth, was being watched by another pair of eyes across the city, like an unlocked door. 3 days passed in exactly the silence Sadie had asked for, and that was the most painful thing, that he obeyed her down to every word. The black SUV on the corner disappeared that very night. The driver who read the newspaper in front of the depot never came back. The phone whose number only 5 people had lay silent in the drawer. And Sadie returned to her old life, asked for her delivery job back at Lackline, ran routes, visited Petey every evening in room 412, where he was recovering slowly but surely, and told herself that the hollow feeling in her chest, each time she passed that empty corner, would heal on its own, like every other wound. She didn't know that across the city, the order to withdraw every presence around her was the hardest order Cesare Falcone had given in 2 years of power, that he had sat before the city map for an entire night before signing it, and that he had only been able to sign it by telling himself he would make up for it in another way, by pouring all his strength into tightening the invisible noose around the one behind everything, faster, more urgently, so that dangerous world would die before it could touch her again. That was the calculation of the man best at calculating in all Chicago, and it contained exactly one error. It assumed the other side needed time too. At 2 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Sadie's old phone lit up on the table beside the sofa bed, an unknown number, and she woke on the first ring because for 3 days she had been sleeping like a sentry. "Miss Brennan." The man's voice on the other end was smoothly polite, like machine oil. "Sorry for the hour, but business doesn't wait. Your loan agreement with Easy Capital, file number 9047, was transferred tonight to a new partner. Your new creditor is a meticulous man. He wants to meet all major clients face to face too." The man paused for one beat as though smiling. "Renegotiate the terms. Right now. There's a car waiting downstairs for you." Sadie sat upright in the dark, her heart beating slow and heavy, and the instinct built from 6 years at the depot screamed that no legal financial transaction in the world happened at 2 in the morning. "I'll meet with a lawyer first," she said, her voice keeping an astonishing levelness, "and you people can send the paperwork by mail like civilized human beings." She lifted her finger toward the button to end the call, and at that exact moment the man's voice changed its tone, still polite, but now the machine oil was coating a blade. "Oh, one more thing, Miss Brennan. That kid at Rush Medical. He's still very weak, isn't he? 3 ribs, fractured orbital socket. It's good that someone visits every night, but the inpatient ward is quiet after 10 o'clock, and the night nurses are thinly staffed. Room 412, isn't that right?" The room around Sadie dropped 10 degrees. She stood, pulled the curtain open just a little, and looked down at the street wet beneath yellow streetlights, where a black sedan was parked right in front of the building, engine running, headlights off, and she knew instantly, with the instinct the past 3 weeks had trained into her, that it wasn't one of Cesare's cars. Cesare's cars never parked so openly right in front of a door, never flashed their headlights once with that kind of arrogance when they saw a curtain move. 10 minutes, the voice said, then hung up. Sadie stood in the dark studio, and in those 10 minutes she did things that later, even she couldn't explain how she had thought of in that order. She put on jeans and the new shoes with stitched soles, the kind she could run in if she had to run. She wrote 3 lines on a sticky note and pressed it to the refrigerator door. If I'm not back by morning, call the police. Black sedan, file number 9047. She slipped the phone, whose number only 5 people had, into the inside pocket of her coat, close to the left side of her chest. And then, with her hand already on the doorknob, she stopped, turned back, and picked that phone up again. She didn't call Cesare, partly because of pride, partly because the last cold piece of reason left in her told her that if this was a trap aimed at him, calling him would close the trap for them. She scrolled down to the second name in the 5-person contact list, the name she had saved during her days as coordinator when Bruno Santoro had been the one approving delivery schedules for the restaurant chain. And she pressed call, held the phone to her ear for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough to hear the first ring, then without waiting for anyone to answer, she dropped the phone with the open call into the inside pocket of her coat, screen facing her chest. Volume locked, an open call, a thin thread lowered into a dark well, and prayed that the person on the other end was sharp enough to understand why there was a call at 2 a.m. with no one saying a word. Then Sadie Brennan drew one long breath, opened the door, and went down 4 flights of stairs toward the black car waiting below, because the boy in room 412 had already bled once for standing close to her, and she swore by her mother in heaven that he wouldn't bleed a second time. The driver didn't say a word, only reached over and opened the rear door from inside. And the moment Sadie bent to step into that dark cabin, she had just enough time to see that another shadowed figure was already sitting on the far seat. Then the door slammed shut behind her, neat and heavy as the lid of a coffin. The sedan drove 20 minutes south, past iron bridges spanning the Black Branch of the river, into South Branch, where old warehouses stood like concrete coffins lined up along the water. And through that whole ride, no one said a word. The shadowed figure sitting beside Sadie only stared straight ahead, while she sat still, both hands on her lap, counting every turn, every street sign sliding past in the light. Loomis Street. The bridge over the river, warehouse number 29, silently reciting them in her mind like a prayer, not so she could remember the way back, but so they could fall into the inside pocket, warming against the left side of her chest, where an open call was still flowing somewhere through the night like a thin vein. The car stopped in front of a warehouse with a brand new sign hung crookedly on the iron door, Meridian Credit Restructuring Office. A sign printed in such a hurry she could almost still smell the plastic. And Sadie was led through that door into a space that made her skin prickle precisely because of how tidy it was. In the middle of the cold, empty warehouse, someone had built a perfect office corner, carpet, a walnut desk, 2 leather chairs, a table lamp spilling warm yellow light, like a theater stage set up in the middle of a desert, and behind that desk a man in his 40s rose to greet her with a banker's smile, tailored gray suit, silk tie, thin-framed glasses. Miss Brennan, thank you for coming despite the inconvenient hour. I am Arkady Volkov. Please sit. Would you like tea? We have good tea. Sadie sat on the edge of the leather chair, and inside her head 2 streams of thought ran side by side. The first was pure fear, pumping cold into the tips of her fingers. The second, the one that had kept her alive through 6 years at the depot and 3 years of debt, was taking notes with icy precision. He's using his real name. He didn't blindfold me on the way here. He's letting me see his face, and people are only this generous with their faces when they believe the audience won't have another chance to tell the story. So she had to make this performance last, as long as she possibly could, and the only way to stretch out a play was to praise the lead actor. Volkov opened the file on the desk with manicured fingers. Contract number 9047, he read, his voice smooth as if reading poetry. $31,000, and do you know, Miss Brennan, I reviewed the terms, and they're shameful. This interest rate far exceeds the Illinois state cap. A contract like this would lose in court without question, so the new creditor, meaning us, wishes to renegotiate with you in a spirit of good faith. He leaned back in his chair, and this was the prelude. Sadie understood. He was enjoying himself, so she swallowed down her fear and stepped into the role, her voice trembling just enough to sound real. I don't understand, Mr. Volkov. If you mean good faith, why at 2 a.m. and why here? And Volkov smiled, the first smile that showed teeth. You're smarter than your file, he said. Fine, I respect intelligent people, so let's skip the tea. You aren't here because of $31,000, Miss Brennan. You are here because you are the most valuable asset that Falcone Cripple owns. The mask fell away that easily, without a sound, and the room set up in the middle of the warehouse suddenly seemed smaller, the yellow lamp suddenly more like the light of an interrogation room, and Sadie heard 2 men shifting somewhere in the darkness behind her. Tomorrow morning, Volkov continued, his voice still smooth. My people will send Falcone a photograph of you sitting in this very chair, along with a simple proposal, operating rights to the South Harbor warehouse route, in exchange for you going home in one piece. He's clever, he'll understand at once, and he'll make the trade, because men in love are the easiest kind in the world to negotiate with. Sadie locked her hands together so they wouldn't shake, and she did the only thing left to do. She fed his pride. You people are insane, she said, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe it. Do you know who he is? He has an army. Who are you to dare touch Cesare Falcone? And it worked, so well it was almost pathetic. Volkov stood, rounded the desk, sat on its edge looking down at her, and began speaking in the voice of a man who had been silent about his own greatness for far too long. You think I spent 3 years milking Archer Heights right on Falcone ground, and survived by luck, little girl. No one swims in a shark tank without someone holding the net. I have someone inside, he tapped his finger on the desk with each word, inside that family, so high up you can't even imagine it. High enough that the cripple's nightly movements are on my desk, before they're on his driver's. Who do you think cleared the road for this business, for 3 years? Who do you think gave the green light for the kid in the hospital last week? And who? He bent closer, the smell of expensive cologne blowing into her face. Do you think promised me that tonight there wouldn't be a single black Falcone car parked near your building? Sadie sat motionless, her eyes wide with exactly the right measure of a terrified hostage. And inside, the second stream of thought was carving every one of his words into stone. Someone inside, 3 years, movement schedule, green light on Petey, while her heart hammered against the small warm object in her breast pocket, begging it, please, please still be alive. Please let someone on the other end be listening, and she had no idea that on the other end of that thin thread, in a penthouse on the north side of the city, the lights had just come blazing on at 2:45, and hell, in a very orderly and very silent way, was beginning to move toward South Branch. That thin thread had been caught from the very first ring. Bruno Santoro never missed a call at 2 a.m, and when he pressed the phone to his ear and heard nothing but the rustle of fabric, the sound of a car door closing, then the steady hum of an engine, he didn't hang up like an ordinary man. He sat upright in the dark, plugged the phone into a speaker, pulled his laptop close, and began doing 3 things at once, listening, locating, and dialing the penthouse line, because 20 years in his profession had taught him that a wordless open call from an intelligent person wasn't a mistake. It was the most delicate cry for help someone under watch could send. At 2:45, the lights in the penthouse blazed on, and Cesare listened through the speaker to what Bruno had heard, the voice of Sadie's invisible guide reciting street names between the silences. Loomis Street. The bridge over the river, warehouse number 29. Smart, he thought, smart and brave enough to hurt. Then he heard the voice of the polite man calling himself Arkady Volkov. Heard the words most valuable asset, heard cripple, and Bruno, sitting on the other end of the line, witnessed through the phone something rare. His boss's breathing changed rhythm exactly once, then returned to stillness, the stillness of ice forming over a violent current. No sirens, Cesare said, no police, not yet. They have her inside, and I'm not wagering her life on the response time of a 911 dispatcher. Call Marco's Bridgeport team, the closest team to South Branch. Tell them to be at those coordinates in 15 minutes. No lights, no noise, and Bruno, record everything from this call, every single word. At 3:20, the South Branch warehouse district was still asleep beneath the drizzle, and 4 black cars glided onto the road along the water with their lights off, parking 200 yards from warehouse number 29, and the men who stepped out did their work in the way their trade had sharpened through 3 generations. No movie drama, no shouting. The guard outside, smoking behind a truck bed, was approached by two dark figures from two sides, and was on the ground before he could understand what had happened, his mouth taped, his wrists locked behind his back. The second man, sitting inside the black sedan, had his window tapped, and when he lowered it, he saw 3 gun barrels and 1 finger pressed to a mouth. He wisely put his hands behind his head, and within 7 minutes, Arkady Volkov's outer ring had evaporated from the board without a sound, without a shot, because Cesare's order had been clear. This was not a war, this was a retrieval, and his men were to fire only if the other side fired first. At 3:35, the iron door of warehouse number 29 opened. It wasn't broken down. It wasn't kicked open. It simply slid aside with a long metallic shriek on its rail, and the damp night air swept in, making the yellow desk lamp tremble, and every head inside the room built in the middle of the warehouse snapped toward it. The 2 bodyguards inside drew their guns by reflex. Volkov sprang up from the edge of the desk, and Sadie, her heart beating into her throat, looked toward the black doorway where, for 3 seconds as long as 3 years, nothing appeared at all. Only the drizzle slanting through the glow of the streetlight behind it. Then out of that rain, slowly, without anyone escorting him, without any gun barrel moving ahead to clear the way, Cesare Falcone placed both hands on the rims of his wheels and rolled himself across the threshold. He came in alone. That was what stunned the armed room into silence, what made the 2 bodyguards forget to aim even while holding their guns, what left Volkov frozen with one hand still halfway to buttoning his suit jacket. Because every scenario in their heads had shouting, formations, chaos to answer with, but none of those scenarios had the most powerful man in Chicago sitting in a wheelchair, bareheaded in the rain, his overcoat speckled with water, rolling each wheel slowly over the concrete floor toward the light by himself, alone, as though an entire room full of guns wasn't worth bringing even one guard with him. And that absolute contempt expressed through his solitude choked the room tighter than any siege could have. Cesare stopped his chair in the middle of the pool of light, let his eyes pass over Sadie for exactly 1 second, 1 second to take inventory. She was whole, and his gaze softened by half a degree before hardening again, then turned to Volkov. "Arkady," he said, as though greeting an acquaintance in a parking lot. Volkov swallowed hard, trying to claw back the upper hand, his hand signaling for the 2 bodyguards to raise their guns. "Falcone, bold move, but stupid. You just rolled yourself into the exact room where I needed you to sit. Now I have both of you. You think that chair gives you power." And Cesare interrupted him by doing something no one expected. He smiled. "You think this chair makes me smaller," he said, his voice no louder than the rain on the sheet metal roof. "For 2 years the whole city has thought so. My enemies thought so. Half my own people thought so. And you, Arkady, you wagered this entire night on that very thought, that a man who has lost his legs is a man who can be forced." He rolled 1 turn of the wheels forward, and the 2 bodyguards, guns in hand, stepped back half a pace, exactly as Pasha's men had done, as though some law of physics failed in front of this man. "Look around, Arkady. Look carefully. Your gate guard is no longer answering his radio. Your driver is lying face down across his seat. The only road out of this warehouse district has had 4 of my cars blocking it for 10 minutes, and outside these sheet metal walls are 16 of the most patient men in the city of Chicago." Cesare let the silence seep through the room, then ended with a question that fell as lightly as a feather and as heavily as a sentence. "So tell me, Arkady, between the 2 of us, who is really the one who can't walk out of this room?" What happened next moved so quickly that later Sadie would remember it only in separate images. The younger bodyguard was the first to break, throwing his gun down onto the carpet and raising both hands. Silent shadows poured through the warehouse door. The remaining bodyguard was stripped of his gun and pinned down in 2 seconds. Volkov lunged toward the side door behind him, and that door opened right in front of his face, from the outside, revealing Bruno Santoro filling the frame like a breathing wall, and Volkov, the loan shark financier in his gray suit and thin framed glasses, sank to his knees on the concrete with his tie twisted to one side, and Cesare didn't bother to look at him again. He had already turned his chair toward Sadie. She was still sitting in the leather chair, both hands clenched together, her whole body beginning to shake as the adrenaline drained away, and he stopped before her, level with her eyes, and held out his hand, not pulling, not grabbing, only offering it and waiting, and Sadie placed her frozen hand into his palm, and in that very moment, through the warmth of skin, she realized something that blurred her eyes instantly. The hand of Cesare Falcone, the man who had just rolled alone through the door into a room full of guns without his breathing changing. That hand was trembling. The police arrived at 4:05, called by the Falcone family's own lawyer with full coordinates and charges, and in the red and blue flashing lights staining the sheet metal walls, Arkady Volkov, along with his 2 bodyguards and the driver, was handcuffed and led into patrol cars on charges of kidnapping in the act, while a nighttime arrest warrant was issued for one more name Sadie heard over the radio, Pavel Orlov, and she sat beneath the silver thermal blanket a paramedic had wrapped around her shoulders, watching it all unfold, without knowing that the most valuable thing that night was not those handcuffs, but the 47-minute recording, sitting in Bruno's device, the recording that held the voice of an arrogant man bragging about someone inside, and that recording was about to light the fuse for the most horrifying Sunday dinner in the history of the Falcone family. The person who received that stack of files was Detective Carol Maddox, 49 years old, 22 years on the job and 6 years with the Joint Organized Crime Task Force between the Chicago Police and the FBI, a woman who had heard enough empty promises in interrogation rooms to believe in nothing anymore except paperwork, and that morning, on her desk, the paperwork rose like a mountain, every copy of Easy Capital's collection ledger, bearing the signatures of more than 60 Lackline Depot drivers, every layer of corporate documentation, traced from Illinois back to Delaware, by an anonymous law office, and delivered as neatly as a Christmas gift. The 47-minute recording from an open call, in which a man's voice identifying himself as Arkady Volkov spoke clear about a hostage, about an offer to exchange a person for control of the harbor warehouse route, about someone inside, and above all, the 4-hour direct statement of witness, Sadie Marie Brennan, who sat before her with her back straight and her voice steady, recounting every sentence from the South Branch night, with a memory sharp enough to make the 2 FBI agents present glance at each other. File number 9047, Loomis Street. Warehouse number 29. His travel schedule is on my desk before it is on his driver's desk. Then came the afternoon. The entire task force would still be talking about years later, when Maddox brought a recorder to room 412 at Rush Medical, where Petey Walsh sat propped against pillows with most of the bandages removed from his face, but his left eye socket still dark purple, and before she could ask the first question, he said, his voice still hoarse but not stumbling once, "I want to tell everything. From the package Pasha tried to force me to carry, to the time he beat me at the depot, to the night in the alley, I remember all 3 of their faces. I'll point out every one of them in court if I have to." And when Maddox, following procedure, reminded him that testifying against these people could be dangerous, that he had the right to remain silent, Petey Walsh looked straight at her, 21 years old and much older than that, then said the sentence Maddox would later admit she had copied into her own private notebook. "I've been scared for too long, Mom. Scared so long I got used to it. I'm not scared anymore." The rest unfolded exactly the way the legal machinery of America grinds, slowly, without drama, irreversible. Facing charges of kidnapping in the act along with a RICO file for organized extortion and loan sharking, meaning the rest of his life behind federal bars, Arkady Volkov sat with his lawyer for exactly 9 days before doing what men like him always did faster than street thugs like Pasha. He calculated, and the calculation produced only one answer: cooperation. So in a windowless room, with a federal prosecutor present, Volkov signed a plea agreement for a reduced sentence and gave a written sworn statement naming the man who had provided the $2 million in seed money for the racket, the man who had protected him for 3 years as he operated on Falcone ground, and the man, this was the part that made the whole room go still, who had sold the travel schedule of the 2 Falcone brothers on a rainy night 2 years earlier, behind Vecchio's restaurant, Carmine Rizzo. 12 days after the rescue night, the Falcone family Sunday dinner took place as it had every Sunday for 3 generations. In the long dining room of the old Bridgeport house, red wine, 16 people around the table, and Carmine Rizzo sitting in the seat of honor at Cesare's right hand, telling an old joke, pouring wine for his nephew in the wheelchair, with the hand that wore the gold ring, completely unaware that the nephew himself had chosen this day, had told Paulie Greco to invite every capo, because there are lessons that must be taught in front of the entire class, and just as the main course was served, The doorbell rang, long and clear, and no one rose to answer because the door had already opened by itself. 6 FBI agents in blue jackets flooding into the dining room, with Detective Maddox holding the arrest warrant, and in the stunned silence of the 16 most powerful people on the south side of Chicago, the name read aloud was not Falcone. Carmine Rizzo. You are under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to kidnap, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs closed around the wrists, bearing the gold ring right on the Sunday dinner table, between a full glass of wine and a plate of steaming food. And Rizzo, after the first shock, did not struggle. He was smarter than that. He only turned to look at Cesare and saw in his nephew's eyes not surprise but waiting that had ripened. And he understood everything in 1 second, understood that he had lost many days earlier, so he asked his final question, hoarse and true, "How long have you known?" And when Cesare did not answer, he gave a harsh laugh and said, "Then why didn't you pull the trigger yourself? Boy, your old man would have pulled it himself." Cesare looked at the man who had taught him how to fire his first rifle, the man who had carried one corner of his brother's coffin, and answered in a voice so level that the whole dining room heard every word. "Death is a debt paid only once, Uncle Carmine, but living in a cage for the rest of your life, waking every morning behind federal bars, knowing that the cripple is still sitting at the head of the table, that is payment in installments." Rizzo was led toward the door, and only at the threshold did he turn back one last time, the mask of 20 years falling away completely, revealing what had been hidden underneath, not a demon, only an old and festering envy. "I served this house for 40 years, he said. 40 years carrying the dirty work for your father and then for you, only to watch the head chair pass to a boy. And after that night in the alley, I thought at least fate had some sense. Because what kind of empire kneels beneath a man who can't even stand?" And Cesare let those words fall all the way to the floor, before speaking the last sentence the two men would ever exchange in this life. "You were wrong your whole life, Uncle Carmen. This empire has never kneeled beneath any pair of legs. It stands on the thing you just lost, a promise kept." The door closed behind the agents, the Sunday dining room sank into a long silence, and not one of the 16 people around the table that day knew that the final move of this game had not yet been played, and that it would not take place in any courtroom or dining room, but at an old depot in Archer Heights, around a burning barrel. 1 week later, on a cold and clear Wednesday morning, the Lackline Depot received a notice for everyone to gather at 8 o'clock, and when more than 60 drivers formed a wide arc in the middle of the lot, no one knew what they were about to witness. They only saw a familiar Escalade parked outside the gate, an iron barrel carried in by 2 men in suits and set down in the middle of the yard, and Cesare Falcone rolling his wheelchair beside it with a stack of blue folders resting on his lap, the files that the purchase of Easy Capital's entire loan portfolio, completed 3 days after Volkov signed his plea agreement, had brought legally into his hands down to every notarized seal. Bruno stood beside him, running his finger one last time along the spines of each folder like an accountant saying farewell, then reported in his familiar, even voice, 42 debt files, boss, the whole Archer Heights area, and Cesare nodded. Beautiful number, he said. And those in the depot, who had witnessed the black morning 3 weeks earlier, suddenly understood and began to laugh before they even had time to grow emotional. Then he lifted the first folder, read aloud the name on its cover, Walter Kowalczyk, original debt $4,200, current balance $11,300, and before 60 pairs of widening eyes, he dropped it into the barrel where the fire had just been lit. The paper caught and curled into a yellow flower of flame, and Walt, the old driver who had hidden that debt from his wife for 2 years, stood rooted in place watching it burn, his lips moving without sound, then turned away and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his flannel shirt, without bothering to hide it from anyone anymore. One folder at a time, one name at a time, Roxanne with the loan she had taken to repair her roof, the young man on the Pilsen route, with the student debt that had cut his schooling short, the file bearing the name Peter Walsh that Petey, discharged from the hospital only the week before, was allowed to drop into the flames with his own hand while applause thundered across the lot, and Roxanne broke down sobbing right in the middle of the circle, crying as she called her husband, her voice shattered. "Honey, it's over, I swear, it burned. I'm standing here watching it burn," and the drivers' faces glowed in the firelight, in a way no bonus had ever managed to make them glow. Because what was burning in that barrel wasn't paper. It was 3 years of lowered heads. When the final folder turned to ash, only then did Cesare speak, brief as always. Starting today, a fund named the Gio Falcone Fund will begin operating with an initial capital of $250,000 for drivers and workers in this area, emergency medical bills, trade training, months when wages fall short. The fund will be run through an independent law office with open books. No one has to thank anyone, and no one, his voice dropped half a tone, cold enough for the whole lot to hear clearly, no one is allowed to mistake this morning for softness. From now on, this area is clean of dirty debt, and I intend to keep it clean, one way or another. Anyone who wants to test that can ask Arkady Volkov what the other way looks like. Standing at the edge of the crowd in a civilian coat, Detective Carol Maddox watched everything, and when Cesare rolled past her as the gathering broke up, she said softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear, "Off the record, thank you. For 3 years we knew this area was bleeding and couldn't get a single witness. On the record, I never said that," and he answered just as softly, "Detective, I didn't hear a thing." Then it was Dennis Kowalski's turn. He had stood silent the whole morning, on the step of the container office, and now he walked into the middle of the lot, before everyone had dispersed, and did something no one expected. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly enough for all 60 people to hear. "I have a few words. For 3 years all of you paid money to those bastards right here on my ground, and I stood behind that glass and watched. I told myself I was powerless. But the truth is I was a coward. I should have been the wall. I hid behind my own paycheck." He turned toward Sadie. "And Miss Brennan, you were the only person brave enough to say that straight to my face. I owe you an apology in front of everyone. Starting next month, every driver gets a 15% raise. Security cameras will be installed across the whole depot, and my office door will never be locked again." That same week, a small piece of news spread through the neighborhood like fire through straw. The Blue Star Diner had changed hands, purchased by a subsidiary in the restaurant chain of a certain family. The new management thanked Mr. Gary Hutchins for his years of service and wished him luck in his next chapter, while the manager's position was given to Lorna, who on her very first day had a sign printed and hung directly above the cash register reading "Every guest is served the same." As for Sadie, when Bruno found her after the burning of the books with the final blue folder still in his hands, the one bearing the name Sadie Marie Brennan, the one Cesare had deliberately not dropped into the flames because he knew she wouldn't allow it, she took it, looked at her own name for a long time, then smiled and did exactly what she had said she would do at the oil-stained wooden table. That very afternoon, she went to the law office managing the fund and signed a payment schedule for $31,000 into the Gio Falcone Fund, month by month, with her own money, in her own way. "This debt is mine," she told the wide-eyed lawyer. "I signed it with my own hand, and I'll pay it with my own hand. The only difference is that now it flows towards something decent." That night, for the first time in 3 years, all of Archer Heights slept without owing a single dollar of dirty money. But in the penthouse on the north side of the city, the man who had just finished repaying every debt for an entire neighborhood sat awake beside the glass wall, because he knew there was still exactly one debt no one had claimed and no one had paid, the debt between him and the woman who had told him not to call her anymore, and for the first time in his life, Cesare Falcone did not know what that debt was supposed to be paid with. A month passed, and Cesare kept the promise he had never spoken aloud to her. He vanished from Sadie's life completely. Not one phone call, not one black car, not one bouquet or card. Only one sentence he said to Bruno on the night after the burning of the debt files, when Bruno asked directly what his boss intended to do about Miss Brennan. And Cesare looked through the glass wall for a very long time before answering. "She was right in that hospital hallway. Bruno, the most dangerous thing I can give her isn't my enemies. It's myself beside her. So I'll give her the only thing I've never given anyone. The right to have no me in her life." As for she learned how to live in a world that had been cleared clean. Aldo, the restaurant chain manager, personally called her twice, and the first time she refused, but the second time he spoke plainly. "Miss Brennan, the coordinator position is still open because no one can do half of what you can. This invitation is mine and no one else's. Your salary file is on my desk, and has never crossed any desk higher than that." And Sadie, after one night of thinking, took the job back by walking into the office on her own 2 feet, signing the contract with her own hand, and during the first month she did 2 things regularly as breathing. On Monday mornings, she transferred her installment payment into the Gio Falcone fund, exactly on time, and on Friday afternoons, she stopped by the law office to pick up the receipt, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the old notebook, where the number 31,000 now grew a little thinner each month. And for the first time in 3 years, that notebook was no longer a sleeping animal, but a countdown calendar. Then came the 3rd week of the month, and what happened to Mrs. Eileen? The chest pain came on a Sunday afternoon, and at the hospital, the cardiologist spoke directly. Her heart valve needed to be replaced, the sooner the better, and the cost after senior health insurance was still a number that made Sadie have to sit down after she heard it, and she was already calculating the old familiar options in her head: where to borrow, what to sell, which extra shifts to take, when the hospital social worker came in with a sheet of paper and said, "Mom, Mrs. Doherty's case qualifies for emergency medical assistance from a new community fund in the area, the Gio Falcone Fund. The full cost of surgery and 3 months of recovery has been approved. She only needs to sign consent." The operation took place on Thursday morning and lasted 4 hours, and Sadie waited in the cardiology hallway with both hands clasped tight together. That hospital hallway, with the smell of disinfectant and the white lights, the kind of place where her life had once broken in half 3 years earlier. And when the doctor stepped out, pulled off his mask, smiled and said, the surgery had gone very well. The old woman was stronger than her age. Sadie nodded and thanked him with perfect composure, walked exactly 5 steps toward the row of waiting chairs, then sank down and cried loudly, cried without managing to cover her face, because 3 years earlier, in a hallway just like this, she had signed loan papers while waiting for terrible news, and today she sat here, still poor and in debt, while the only person close to family she had left was saved by the organized kindness of a man she had driven out of her life, and those 2 tears separated by 3 years, one born of helplessness and one born of being held up, turned out to taste exactly the same. From that day on, the emptiness inside her would no longer lie still. It appeared in the smallest places. In the way each morning when she went out to her car, she still glanced toward the corner, where the black SUV used to park, and saw the empty curb like a pulled tooth. In the way after making coffee, she still reached by reflex for a second cup and then froze. In the way the phone whose number only 5 people had was still fully charged every night, though it had not rung once in 30 days. And in the way she began talking to her mother's photograph more often. "Mom, I don't know whether missing a dangerous man counts as foolish." And on the north side of the city, that man was living through the heaviest weeks of his 2 years in power. The earthquake Rizzo had left behind had shaken the family. Old capos needed reassurance. Rizzo's businesses had to be cut open layer by layer to see whether any hidden infection remained. Sleepless nights ran into one another in the study, and Bruno noticed one detail he told no one, that at the end of every such night, his boss opened the desk drawer, took out a sheet of paper, gone soft with handling, the paper from that night in November, where the line Lackline had long since been crossed out, the line Volkov crossed out, and one line added later and crossed out too, Carmine. Every name on that page had been settled fairly, except for one name at the very top, Sadie Brennan, not crossed out, not touched, simply lying there at the head of the page, like a question the man who wrote it did not dare answer. And on the 31st night, when Cesare was once again sitting with that page beneath the low lamp, Bruno Santoro did something he had never done in 20 years of service. He spoke when he had not been asked. "Boss, I've followed you long enough to know it isn't my place to say this, but there are debts we can claim, and there are debts." He looked at the uncrossed name at the top of the page, that we have to let someone bring to us on their own. Cesare did not answer, did not nod, did not shake his head, only fold the paper and put it back into the drawer. But that night, for the first time in a month, he told the driver to take the route through Archer Heights on the way home, not to stop, not to park, only to pass by. And he had no idea that behind the lit 4th-floor window, a woman had also just taken an envelope from a drawer and was counting small bills into it, one $5 bill, $1 bills, and coins, until the number stopped at exactly 23. On Friday afternoon, after picking up her monthly installment receipt at the law office, Sadie did not drive home. She drove north, to the oldest restaurant in the Falcone family chain, the red brick building on the edge of River North, with a brass sign engraved with the single word Falcone, and she arrived in that in-between hour after lunch and before dinner, when the restaurant was at its emptiest, because some things a person only has enough courage to do once and does not want an audience for. The guard in the lobby recognized her at once. Sadie saw it in the tiny jolt that went through him, in the way he did not know whether he should stop her or bow to her, and she spared him the choice. "I need to see Mr. Falcone," she said. "I know he has an early dinner here on Fridays alone, at the table in the back. I used to schedule deliveries for this kitchen." The guard spoke very softly into his radio, listened, then stepped aside, and Sadie walked through the wide dining room draped in white tablecloths, to the farthest corner where the light was low and warm, where Cesare Falcone sat behind a plate of food that had barely been touched, and the moment he looked up and saw her, Sadie witnessed a transformation opposite to the one she had seen that night at the Blue Star Diner. Everything flat and cold withdrew in a single breath, revealing something underneath so naked that she almost looked away, because it felt as though she were seeing something private. Miss Brennan," he said, his voice still keeping its levelness, though his hand had already closed the notebook in front of him faster than necessary. Sadie did not sit. She stood beside the table, took an envelope from her coat pocket, and emptied it onto the white cloth, one $5 bill, 15 $1 bills, and $3 in coins arranged in a small stack, a total of $23 lying in the yellow lamplight, like a declaration made of wrinkled paper and metal. "I calculated it carefully," she said. "Everything you did, the 42 cars, the Volkov people, the debt books for the whole depot, Mrs. Eileen's surgery, all of that you did for Archer Heights, for 60 drivers, for your brother's justice. Those things are not my debt, and I won't take them onto myself. But these $23 are private between you and me, and today I am paying them back." She pushed the little stack of money toward him. "Now we're even, Cesare. No one owes anyone anymore. No debt, no obligation, no reason at all. Which means that if I sit down in this chair now, it won't be because of a debt. It will be because I choose to." The room went so quiet she could hear the candle trembling on the next table. Cesare looked at the small pile of money, then at her, for a very long time, and when he spoke, his voice turned rough on the first words. "Sadie, you have to understand what you are choosing. I won't lie to you. I am the man you saw that night at the diner, both of the men you saw. My world cannot be changed, only managed. There will always be midnight phone calls, names I don't tell you, days when you will have to watch me go back to being the man I have to be. A wise woman would take the freedom she just fought back and go far away." Sadie pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "I have already seen the worst of your world," she said. "It dragged me into a car at 2 o'clock in the morning, locked me in a warehouse, and I listened while it priced my life against a harbor warehouse route. And do you know something? That terrible world was still kinder to me than the world that left me alone for 27 years. The world that let my mother die in debt, let a boy get his face beaten in while the police only came to write a report, let 60 people lower their heads for 3 years without anyone bothering to look down. Your world at least understands that a debt is sacred." She placed her hand on the table, palm up, an invitation. "So don't tell me to go far away, Cesare. I have been invisible my whole life. You were the first person who saw me." He looked at her hand, then placed his own over it, and this time neither hand trembled. He leaned across the corner of the table, slowly, giving her a whole lifetime to change her mind, and she did not change her mind, and their first kiss tasted of cold coffee and 31 days of silence, lasting until the candle beside them had burned down by 1 notch. When they drew apart, Cesare did not say anything ornate. He only did one thing. He gathered the $23 in loose money from the tablecloth, smoothed each bill flat, and placed all of it inside the left breast pocket of his suit jacket, right over his heart, then buttoned the jacket as though locking a safe. "You have just made the most expensive mistake of your life," he said, and the corner of his mouth curved in a way no one in Chicago had ever seen before. "Maybe," Sadie replied, leaning back in her chair, "but at least this time I read the contract carefully before signing." And beyond the restaurant window, the city began to light up, while neither of them knew that 6 months later, at an old depot on the south side, their story would be told every day in a way neither of them could have imagined. 6 months later, if you drove past the Lakeline Depot in Archer Heights on a Wednesday morning, you wouldn't recognize it anymore. Security cameras now glittered along the fence beneath the early summer sun. The new pay scale was posted publicly, right on the office door, where Dennis Kowalski now worked behind a door that was never locked. And the most important thing was the thing no longer there. No more quiet hands folding money every Wednesday morning. No more heavy silence waiting for a car to glide through the gate. Only the sound of Walt playing country music from his cab, and Roxanne's laughter ringing across the lot as she told the story of how her husband had just repainted their kitchen. With the money that once would have been handed over to 3 years of fear, Petey Walsh now only ran afternoon routes, because in the mornings he sat in a classroom at the community college over by Kelly, his first semester paid in full by a Gio Falcone Fund scholarship. And the week before, he had ridden his bike to the depot only to show Sadie his first essay with an A on it, holding the paper in both hands as though it were a medal. And he said something to her more precious than any grade, Miss Sadie. You know what? Yesterday I got off work at 10 o'clock at night, walked through that same alley, and realized I wasn't afraid to go home from work anymore. Mrs. Eileen Doherty, with her heart beating stronger through its new valve than it had in the past decade, had replanted the red geraniums outside her apartment door, and every Sunday afternoon her room smelled of soup, now cooked for 2 people, sometimes 3, on the evenings when a wheelchair appeared on the 4th floor and the old woman, the only person in the world who dared scold the most powerful man in Chicago for not eating enough vegetables, was obeyed by him without argument. As for Sadie, every morning she still woke at 5:30, still touched her mother's picture frame, still stopped by the apartment across the hall to take Mrs. Eileen's blood pressure. Only now, when she stepped down onto the street, there was always a black car parked quietly on the far corner, the driver behind the wheel like part of the landscape. And in a ritual that had become habit over the past 6 months, Sadie crossed the street with 2 hot coffees in her hands, passed one through the lowered window, said a few words about the weather, and only then went to her car for work, because she had learned that there were some forms of watchfulness that didn't need to be resisted, only invited to have a cup of coffee. In her desk drawer, beside the old debt notebook that had already grown nearly half thinner, there was a folded piece of paper with blunt handwriting she knew by heart, down to every stroke. The debt has been paid, but the guard never rests. And if this whole story had to be told in one single sentence, it would be this: one act of unconditional kindness. Something that cost only $23.30 of courage, brought down an entire loan-sharking empire, exposed a traitor who had hidden for 2 years in the one place no one dared to look, set 60 people free after 3 years of lowered heads, and taught a man whom people had feared all his life a lesson no power could ever buy, that what human beings hunger for most is not to be feared, but to be respected as human beings, to be seen before being judged, whether we sit in a wheelchair, wear a worn-out delivery jacket, or carry a family name that can make a whole city fall silent. Because you see, it was never really about the meal at all. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button so we know you stayed here with Sadie and Cesare until this very moment. Share this video with someone you believe still carries kindness in the middle of a hurried life, because perhaps today they need this exact story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we share every day. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? Have you ever given a small kindness without expecting it to return, only to have it change your life? Or have you ever been seen by a stranger at the very moment when you thought you were invisible? Please write it in the comments. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep inside your heart, because each real story from you is the reason this channel exists. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. May you and your family always have good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.